The story begins in a huge estate, with a young woman with purple hair running through the hallways, apparently desperate to reach her destination quickly. Upon reaching the bedroom door, she opens it, shouting for her master. Then she enters the room in desperation. However, to her unfortunate surprise, the system notifies her that she has failed the mission and Diane Redford is already dead. The cause was described as poisoning by Aqualicia. Next, a notification states that the game had ended. The young woman then lowers her head and clenches her fists, which begin to tremble with so much anger. The girl cannot hold back, and while pulling her hair, screams how inconsolable she is that he died so quickly. The truth is that the story takes place in a time when virtual reality games are all the rage. And the game that the protagonist is playing is called The Young Masters of the Monstrous Mansion, which is actually very popular among women. The place where the game takes place is a cursed mansion. The idea is to choose one of the boys and protect him from evil spirits or monsters, to help him grow and become an excellent adult. The game is so detailed that there are rumors of it being filled with the souls of the developers themselves. In addition to the graphics being truly beautiful to behold, players can choose from more than 30 different roles to play in the game, including roles such as maid, private tutor, priest, hunter, or distant relative of the noble family, among others. And although the protagonist admits she is not a gamer, this game ended up catching her attention, and so she decided to play as a housemaid. And the young master she chose to serve was little Diane Redford. Despite being very handsome, the boy would die in the blink of an eye. She admits that she underestimated how difficult the game could become and only chose the young master she thought was the most handsome, learning the hard way because Diane lived in an impenetrable fortress. However, she did not give up on the boy and did not spare money in her quest to save him. Our protagonist resorted to pay to win, and after an absurd number of ridiculous deaths, she finally managed to get him to reach the age of 16 and was about to finish the game. However, it only took being away for 2 seconds and the boy died. The protagonist had repeatedly told him not to leave the bed, which was a safe zone. And although Diane had promised that he would obey her, in the end he left and put himself in danger. The evil spirits that managed to kill him laughed in a terrifying way, their chilling laughter echoing through the environment. They approached and threatened to take her away too, so she would not feel alone. Annoyed, the maid pointed the hunting rifle she was holding at the ghosts and fired, although she achieved nothing with it. Suddenly, a question appeared on the screen asking if she would like to save the video of episode 214. Displeased, the young woman lowered her weapon and chose the option, yes. She was outraged at the game's creators for making her play so many times without ever reaching a happy ending. Then, when she was about to give up once and for all, her eyes fell upon the beautiful young man in front of her. The sight of the boy with silver hair was too beautiful to ignore. The protagonist even tried to hold firm to her decision. However, as had been the case the last times, 10 seconds after looking at Diane, her determination began to return quickly. No matter how terrible the survival rate was, she had grown too attached to change to another character. The maid then swallowed her tears and reached out her hand to caress Dean's face, while speaking lovingly for him not to worry, that next time she would definitely save him. It was then that something strange happened. A voice echoed in her ears like a macabre whisper, asking if she was serious and declaring that, if so, he would leave the boy in her care. The next moment, thorny roots began to grow and wrap around the young woman. Before she could scream, the roots enveloped her entire body, making her desperately wonder if that was a bug in the game. Then her vision darkened, and she lost consciousness. After that, loud sounds of someone knocking on a door wake the protagonist. She awakens confused in front of young Master Diane's bedroom, accompanied by one of the mansion's maids who is knocking on the boy's door, requesting permission to enter. Seeing the scene, she then realizes that she seems to have returned to the beginning of the game. The maid announces the arrival of the young master's caretaker, and then a clear young voice sounds from behind the door, complaining about the delay. But something did not match the protagonist's memories about the beginning of the story, because the woman had just called her a caretaker and the young woman had never chosen such a role. The two entered the young master's chambers and found him thoughtful, gazing at something through the window. Diane turned irritably and asked how she could be 5 minutes late on her first day of work. When she saw him, the protagonist's heart nearly leapt out of her chest. For even though it was the 44th time she had seen the scene, he was still extremely adorable. The servant bowed politely to him, apologizing and explaining that there had been a small confusion during the preparation. Then, she turned to the protagonist and asked her to formally introduce herself to the young master. Calling her Miss Lin, the maid insisted on questioning what the young woman's surname was, annoyed that she had not properly introduced herself to her new master. To which the young woman simply said, "Log out," wanting to leave the game because although Diane was very cute, she had no patience for such a system error. However, only a deep silence took over the place. Diane frowned and said that Lin Logout had an unusual sound and asked if it was a northern-style name. Lin absent-mindedly replied that Logout was not a surname, but stopped mid-sentence for she realized something strange. If that was the first scene of the game, danger was about to appear. Thus, she shouted for Diane to duck and threw the vase from the table. She remembered that at the beginning of the game, the headmaid would turn into a terrifying monster. The vase, thrown with force, hit the woman directly, spilling holy water onto the headmaid and making her let out a bizarre scream. Diane felt a chill down his spine upon realizing that the headmaid was actually a Moros. Lin quickly looked around and noticed a pair of swords hanging on the wall, thinking she could use them to destroy the monster. But before proceeding, she threw a towel over Dian to protect his eyes from what was to come. After all, the sweet boy should not be exposed to something so violent. The monster began to stir and move toward them. With a swift movement, Lin grabbed one of the swords while ordering Diane to stay under the sheet. Quickly, she jumped over the maid, attacking her. Dealing with that was easy. After all, she had played this scene more than 43 times. A single blow to the neck and the monster was on the floor. But things did not happen as usual, and the black vital fluid splashed across the heroine's face and all over her clothes. Normally, scenes like this were censored by the game. Lin was perplexed by this, not really understanding why things were happening that way. Removing the tablecloth from over himself, Diane asked Lin if the monster had been eliminated. The answer was yes, for black flowers were already blooming around the fallen maid. Our protagonist explains to us that in this world, when someone passes away, flowers bloom around the body. When it is a human, the flowers are red. But when it is a monster like a Moros, the flowers are black. The maid then began to turn into ashes, disappearing and scattering into the wind. It was a scene she had seen many times in the game. But now everything seemed strangely real. Realizing this, Lin remembered the voice she had heard before the supposed bug. Her greatest fear seemed to be coming true. Perhaps she really had been sucked into the game. The scene cuts to Lin and the young master sitting at a table, still in shock. An uncomfortable silence reigning between them as maids hurried about, organizing everything. One of the maids approached Lin, explaining that they would clean the young master's chambers, and in the meantime, the two of them should wait there. She looked in Dean's direction and noticed that he was clearly still very shaken by everything that had happened. So she asked the maid if they could please clean quickly. She did not know how to comfort him and was clearly uncomfortable, since normally she would always skip to the next episode once the danger had passed. So she tried to exit again, but this time only screaming internally. She shouted game terms like settings, item window, character information, and check the map, but it was all useless. The atmosphere was strange and suffocating. In addition, the little boy seemed to be afraid of the protagonist. She tried to explain to Diane that she was a good person and that he should not be afraid of her. But it did not help, for the boy was still frightened and extremely cautious with her, which was not surprising given what had happened in their first encounter. Lin then tried to shift her attention elsewhere and asked one of the maids to bring a vase of holy water and some hot tea. Soon, a vase full of holy water decorated with flowers was placed on the table, and 2 steaming cups of tea were also brought to the place. In addition, the maid brought a towel so that Lin could clean the dirt from her body. It was no wonder that Diane was afraid, given the state of the protagonist's face and clothes. The boy did not drink his tea and only kept watching his reflection in the beverage. Trying to improve their relationship and the mood, Lin suggested that they introduce themselves to each other again. It was then that a childish voice echoed in the air, asking what all that was. The intruder said he had heard that a new caretaker had arrived at room 7, and so he decided to take a look. His name was Minwell, a blonde boy who seemed to be about the same age as Diane, and was the young master of room 2. He was a popular character, often featured in videos posted by other players. Lin thought once or twice about switching to him because of her constant failures with Diane, as the little one was her second favorite. The boy went straight to the point and asked if it was true that the new companion had eliminated a Moros. But upon seeing the black stains, Minwell realized that the rumors were true. Interested, he asked the name of the new caretaker, but the answer came from Diane, who wanted to know why he was so interested in his caretaker. Mocking Diane, Minwell said he didn't need to get so angry, and that he only wanted to know her name. Or maybe he was afraid that his first caretaker would be taken away from him. Minwell maliciously commented that he understood Diane's concern. After all, the difference in level between them was quite large, and clearly if she could choose, well, the choice was obvious. Dian bit his lips as if those words had struck him straight in the heart. Such an expression made the protagonist deeply moved, for she finally realized that he was being aggressive because of jealousy. She then thanked the bugs deeply because she had never seen Dian like that before. Minwell approached Lin asking why she did not become his caretaker, and immediately Dian stood up, unable to hold back any longer, making it clear that Lin was already his caretaker. The two stared at each other and the atmosphere became a little more tense. A little distressed, the young woman asked them to calm down and not fight, but the two continued staring at and provoking each other, until finally they both snorted in disdain at one another and turned their heads. Moments later, Minwell pulled one of the chairs and sat at the table with them without ceremony. Dian, still annoyed, watched Minwell with a piercing gaze. Calling the protagonist a newbie, the visitor from room 2 asked her to be honest. Then he asked which of the young masters had been her first choice when she applied for the job at the mansion. Minwell was quite confident that it had been him, as he was very popular among the caretakers, and she had probably only chosen room 7 because it was the only one available, leaving Diane feeling even lower than before. Seeing him like that, Lin cried internally, outraged at Diane's lack of confidence. After all, he was handsome and cute. Then the protagonist confidently declared that she had chosen Diane of her own will, making her favorite lift his head, surprised and touched. Those words seemed so ridiculous to Minwell that he had to confirm if he had heard wrong. However, the blonde still did not want to throw in the towel and asked about her second choice, to which she replied it was the same as the first. After another surprise, he insisted on asking about the third choice, and again she replied that it was Diane. It was true that, for a brief moment, she had considered switching to a different character, but she could not say that in front of her favorite. At last, she declared that no matter how many chances of choice she had, she would always prefer Diane. At that moment, guilt weighed on her shoulders, since she had chosen the same boy 43 times, but had also let him die in all of them. Minwell, his pride wounded by the absence of his name on the young woman's lips, declared that she was terrible at judging people's character. "I don't want an idiot like you anyway," Minwell shouted and immediately left the room, slamming the door. When they were finally alone, the atmosphere became calmer. Diane asked if everything she had said was true. He looked so adorable that the protagonist was moved by so much cuteness. Lin enthusiastically confirmed that Diane had really been her first choice and demonstrated her loyalty by calling him master. This time, the atmosphere was no longer strange and rigid, and the caretaker was glad that the boy no longer seemed afraid of her. Then she straightened her posture and introduced herself as Lynn Dorchester, declaring that she would serve as his caretaker from that day on. Clearly happy, Diane replied that it was a pleasure to meet her. He commented that she had a different way of speaking, very informal like that of a maid and not of a caretaker, and that this was quite curious. Ian explains that she was used to speaking that way and asks if it bothered him. But Diane said it was fine and that she should speak however she wanted. Now that she stopped to think, Lynn realizes that she had never heard of the caretaker class in the game. It was not one of the options. She could ask Diane, but she fears that he might find it strange and see her as incompetent for not knowing something about the job she applied for. And from the way he looks at her, full of trust, she cannot disappoint him. Lynn then decides that at another time she will have to find out about the caretakers, whether it is a new class or part of the bug. With the mood between them much better, the protagonist decides to explain about the headmaid, but Diane interrupts her saying that when he saw her transformed, he realized she was a Moros. He only got scared because he had never seen one up close. The boy was so cute that Lynn felt as if her heart was being punched by a kitten's paws, and she comments that of course things like that would not scare him. Diane becomes a little embarrassed for having frozen in fear and says that he is not as fragile as he seems and that he was only surprised, which is why he took a while to act. But the next time that happened, he would be the one to protect her. The young master's cuteness strikes the protagonist right in the heart. Moved, she thanked Diane and declared that he was as cute as a little fairy. Diane was surprised by that comparison, but Lynn quickly apologized and the two continued drinking their tea. Mentally, Lynn felt sad that the bug would not let her record that scene. The two continued talking and laughing for a while, until another maid appeared to guide Lynn to her quarters. Upon hearing this, Diane quickly stood up, saying that he was tired and she should go rest too. The cutie was clearly worried about the hard day she had. Lynn said she would not mind staying a little longer, but Diane insisted that she go rest. Noticing the young master blush, she smiled and agreed to leave, wishing him a good rest. Upon arriving at her quarters, she saw that the player's room remained the same as in the original game and that the only difference was that the system did not respond there either. She sat on the bed and wondered how long she would remain trapped there. Normally, a player cannot stay connected for more than 48 hours. Only, since the game's time runs differently than in the real world, that amount of hours would be equivalent to 2 weeks within the story of the game, which was bad because Lynn had to work on Monday. So she lay down on the bed frustrated, hoping the bug would be fixed before that. At that moment, the last words she had heard in the previous session echoed again in her head, and she wondered if that was really just an error. And if it was not an error, what should she do? She stood up determined to do something instead of just lying there. She went to the bathroom to wash her face and noticed how real things seemed, almost as if the virtual had become reality. But when she looked in the mirror, she convinced herself that although everything seemed so real, her appearance proved that it was still just the game, because her face was the same as the character she had created. Lynn was glad that at least the error had not affected that, because she had spent a lot of time customizing the character. After a deep sigh, she decided to look at her wardrobe, where there was a uniform that seemed to be provided by the mansion. She had never seen it before, but maybe it was specific to the caretaker job. In addition, looking more closely, the young woman realized that her suitcase, an essential item for the development of the story, was missing. Normally, when the mission begins, it should appear automatically on the bed, but it was nowhere to be found. It should contain the basic weapons and some personal items, along with a manual related to her job. Lynn thought she could look in the manual to see what this caretaker class was. But since she did not find it, she remained with the idea that it was something like a nanny. She found it strange that there was only a single uniform for her function and began to believe that the cause of the error had been the appearance of this new class. At that moment, the protagonist sadly remembered all the items and accessories she used to have compared to the single outfit they had given her. It was better for the game developers to restore everything. Otherwise, she would go directly to the studio to protest. After putting her clothes back in the closet, the young woman decided to look for her suitcase outside the room. She walked through much of the mansion, but found nothing. At first, she believed that the maids might know where her belongings were. Not even the maid who had carried her bag to the room showed any knowledge and insisted that she had not stolen or hidden it. Since the young servant trembled like a rabbit in front of a lion, the caretaker did not prolong the conversation and moved on. She was not able to find her bag, so she needed to find a usable weapon elsewhere. Of course, in a game of this genre, there were swords, axes, and spears decorating the walls of all rooms and corridors, but it was not practical to carry them all the time. At that moment, something round rolled to the protagonist's feet. When she bent down to pick up the object, she noticed it was a small tin container. It belonged to Luska, the angel of room number 1. But when Lynn approached to return it, the caretaker responsible for that young master immediately took the object from her hands. She was a cold woman and asked the protagonist not to speak with her charge without permission. And the look she gave her afterward was far too intense for two people meeting for the first time. Although Lynn explained that she was only returning something the boy had dropped, the red-haired woman threw the tin back to the ground, arguing that she could not know what the protagonist had done to the object. Such words made the novice's mouth fall open, as she was basically being treated like a criminal. Ignoring the expression on her colleague's face, the veiled employee turned to Luska and led him away. That new character had reached another level of strangeness, but one could not deny that her beauty was unique. Lynn was thrilled. It was always good for a veteran player to see more about the game she loved so much. Moments later, Lynn went to the mansion's courtyard near a lion statue. From there, she retrieved a small box where a simple and well-preserved revolver was kept. And although she was only supposed to use it when episode 10 approached, she needed the weapon in the present moment to defend her young master and herself. In addition, she was certain she would return the object to its proper place once it was no longer needed. Seconds later, the protagonist saw two children laughing and playing in the distance. They commented on how funny it had been to see the expression on the face of a man named Cheswick the moment he fell into the lake. Lynn watched the scene from behind the bushes and wondered who this man was, whom she had never heard of before. But since she had already found what she was looking for, it was time to return to the mansion. At the moment she stepped out from the bushes, a person drenched from head to toe appeared. Startled by the frightening expression of the figure, Lynn prepared herself for a possible future battle. However, she soon noticed that he was just a soaked and ordinary man. The man quickly greeted her and realized she must be the new caretaker of Room 7. After returning the greeting, the player noticed that the man's physique was quite impressive, and caught herself admiring every part of his body. He was very well trained, and because of that, Lynn was certain the man was definitely not just any servant. The new character then approached and revealed that he was very surprised at the arrival of a caretaker for Room 7. Then he gave a slight smile and asked why she was there alone. wondering if she had gotten lost. Lin replied that yes, pretending she had forgotten the way. After all, she could not say she had gone there to retrieve an item. With that, the man showed sympathy and explained that the mansion was so vast it was common to get confused at first. He then assumed a gentlemanly attitude and asked if she would like him to show her the place. Lin showed herself to be delighted with the offer, although she already knew the place like the back of her hand, considering all the times she had played. However, she recommended that he go in first and dry himself, declaring that the tour could wait. The man then apologized for his state and explained that he had been trying to retrieve a ball the children had dropped in the lake. But he reassured her, saying that the day was warm enough and soon he would be completely dry. The two walked calmly through the property and made a fine pair. It was then that the employee finally introduced himself as Chezik, revealing that he had already been working there for a year. Although focused on the conversation, the protagonist could not help admiring the man's beauty. When she introduced herself, Chezik praised her name and welcomed her once again. He was another character she had never seen before, and while she wondered what his role might be, the blonde turned and asked if he was walking too fast. The employee did not take long to open a mischievous smile and praise her for her feat of killing a Moros on the first day of work. Although she insisted that it had been nothing special, the man declared that the fact the monster had been defeated without help made the feat impressive enough. In the game, the boys are always in danger due to the frequent appearance of ghosts and monsters. The beings known as Moros are terrible creatures whose name comes from Latin and means corpse, end, and ruin. They are as dangerous as their name suggests, but destroying the headmaid was easy, since it was a tutorial stage that she had already played several times. However, this was not a reality that an NPC like Chezik could understand. With that, it did not take long for Lin to discover that there were already rumors about her having gone through elite training. The protagonist showed surprise at the blonde man's words, who explained that since the employees working in the mansion before her arrival had not received detailed information about her, they decided to bet on several theories, this one being the main one. But seeing how she had been able to defeat a Moros on her first day of work, the man assumed people had guessed correctly. As the error did not allow Lin to check her character's experiences, she could not deny it without thinking. But she was surprised to learn that there was something like elite training, as she believed that caretakers were hired through an interview, just like the other employees. In addition, Chezik told her that the other caretakers were very curious about her and commented that the protagonist probably already knew the one responsible for room number 4, since he was the only employee of the Stella organization present in the mansion at the time. The two then continued walking, while the young woman wondered if Stella was the name of a group of elite caretakers, until the man stopped and asked if she already knew about the welcome dinner that would be held in her honor that night. Lin had not been informed, but remained silent while the man declared that the two of them would have more time to talk when they were at the table. At the moment the novice expressed her delight with the idea, someone approached. It was Minwell, and he did not seem very pleased with the fact that Chezik was spending his time with the new caretaker. The look he cast at Lin made it clear that he was still upset about not being among her favorites. Thus, in an aggressive and impatient tone, the angel told the man to hurry up because they still had a lot to do. Without protest, the employee followed the young master, telling the protagonist that apparently the tour would have to be left for a later moment. And when asked if he was also a caretaker, the blonde replied that he was responsible for Minwell in room number 2. The sun was already setting when the protagonist returned to her young Master Dian's room. There had been so many setbacks and peculiar encounters that the day had passed in the blink of an eye. The one responsible for room number 2 seemed to be a pleasant person, but he was also a little strange. And the veiled woman who protected Luska from the first room had an extremely mysterious aura. Although she considered herself an expert, Lin still had much to learn about the secrets of that mansion. She had been very excited to meet such interesting new characters, and since she had already managed to get her hands on a new weapon, she thought that all that was left to do was return to Dian. She expected to find him well-behaved in his room, grumpy and dissatisfied with the long wait. But a loud scream brought her back to harsh reality. When she turned, the new caretaker saw one of the maids quickly approaching, shouting that something terrible had happened. And the moment she heard her master's name, Lin froze, fearing that the terrible fate of her fragile protégé was about to repeat itself. Worried, Lin abruptly entered room 7, calling for her young master. Dian was lying on his bed, with his foot bandaged and an air of slight embarrassment. Lin asked what had happened, but he avoided the subject, saying it was nothing, just a minor injury. Trying to change the subject, he asked where she had been because he had gone to her room earlier but did not find her. With tears in her eyes upon seeing how swollen Dian's foot was, The protagonist replied that she had gone looking for her missing luggage. Incredulous, Lin could not understand how he had injured his foot so badly in such a short period of time. Diane only sighed and said that it was a small fracture caused by a fall. Lin knew that Diane always got hurt easily, but she believed that he would be fine during the rest of the first day, since she had taken care of the threat of the head maid. Because of that, she huffed and declared that from that moment on, she would have to stay by his side always, so that he would not get hurt so often. Seeing how poorly the bandage had been done, she turned and began picking petals from a rose that was near the bed, telling the young master to wait a little because she would help him feel less pain and also redo his bandages. Since her protege had always been under constant threat, her first aid skills and medical knowledge had grown drastically during the game sessions. And although the mansion had doctors, they were rather useless, unable even to treat a small wound. As soon as Lin finished redoing the bandage, Diane already commented that he was feeling much better. Our protagonist imagined that the glitch must have reset her first aid skills, and given the difficulty of doing such a simple bandage, she imagined that her skill must currently be at level 1, which meant she would have to practice a lot by taking care of as many people as possible to gain experience. Diane told her how he had gotten hurt, and Lin was quite surprised, knowing that he had fallen while trying to look for her. Looking away, he explained that he had wanted to accompany her to her welcome dinner. This made the woman let out a deep sigh and state that she would be very happy to go anywhere in his company. But since he had gotten hurt that night, it would be better for him to stay resting in his room. Diane was very disappointed and insisted that it was nothing and that it would not stop him from accompanying her to the dinner. The protagonist then retorted in a playful tone that if he wanted so badly to go, there were some ways, and among them was going to meet everyone in a wheelchair. But since that would show the others that he had been hurt and make him look weak, the boy immediately refused that option. The protagonist then clenched her fists to contain herself in the face of so much cuteness, because it was very adorable that her protege wanted to appear strong in front of others. Thus, with a downcast look, the young master asked Lin if she was willing to go without him. Diane then concluded that she would go alone, since he could not go. But Lin affirmed that no, she simply would not go to dinner, because as she had said earlier, she did not want to leave him alone. The young master insisted that she should go, stating that he would be fine on his own, and that the welcome dinner had been prepared especially for her and she needed to be present. After all, there would be no other dinner like that in the mansion. Lin noticed Diane's trembling voice, but she believed she understood how he felt, because although she could live that experience again whenever she wanted, for Diane, everything was happening for the first time. Besides, in the current scenario, it seemed that he was the only boy in the house who had been so long without a caretaker, which made that welcome dinner very special for him. Thus, the protagonist had no other option but to go. And when Diane was about to ask a favor, she interrupted him, declaring that she would carry him to the dinner. Diane was incredulous and embarrassed by the suggestion, but Lin insisted, saying that this would be the best and most logical option for both of them to attend the celebration. Her plan was to enter carrying Diane in her arms like a baby because she was very emotional and excited to be his caretaker. However, the idea of being carried like a baby in front of everyone made Diane a little irritated. He immediately started arguing with her, asking what was going through her head to suggest something so embarrassing. Lin still tried to appeal with tears, saying that he had no heart for rejecting her idea so easily, but he would never subject himself to that kind of thing. Thus, when the moon was already high in the sky, Lin made her way to the banquet hall, dressed in the only outfit available in her wardrobe. As she walked, she dwelled on the fact that Diane had rejected her idea, even though she was certain she could have carried him easily. And although he seemed clearly upset about not being able to go, he made a point of ensuring that she went. But deep down, Lin knew that Diane truly hated to show any weakness in front of others. Since that was the case, our protagonist was determined to enjoy the dinner as best as possible. And since all the other caretakers would be present, she would probably be able to get more information. As soon as she entered the hall, she noticed that the place was really crowded. She also noticed that a large part of the caretakers were NPCs she had never seen, which was curious. Lin greeted everyone politely, but only Chezek returned the greeting. All the others cast her cold looks and remained silent, as if judging her presence there. Although that meeting was considered a welcome dinner, it seemed that none of them cared to properly receive her. Until one of the angels, called Vivi, made an enthusiastic comment upon seeing her. But he was quickly scolded by his caretaker. Taking advantage of Vivi's remark and trying to improve the atmosphere, Lin introduced herself formally, saying that from that day on she would be the caretaker of Master Dian, who resided in room number 7. She walked to one of the empty chairs while everyone watched her. and she sat down imagining she had done the right thing but was immediately confronted with a look of contempt from one of the other caretakers, who declared that apparently she was trying to draw attention on her first day. The same woman then asked why she was wearing that kind of clothing at a dinner. Lynn replied that she had only worn the one thing that was in her wardrobe and asked if that was a problem. Mentally, she did not understand the woman's questioning since her uniform was quite pretty, and she was sure she had made the right choice. The man sitting in front of her commented, agreeing with the other caretaker, that the newcomer really must love being the center of attention, because first there was the incident with the Moros and now that outfit. As the atmosphere was getting tense, Lynn decided to change the subject, suggesting that they introduce themselves, since everyone seemed to know her, but she knew nothing about any of them. With the exception, of course, of Mr. Chezik, with whom she had spent part of the afternoon talking. This made the green-haired caretaker open a mocking smile and ask if she had not spent her time learning more about them because they were not part of the elite like her. Such words left Lynn very confused, since as that was her first day in the mansion as a caretaker, it should be obvious to everyone that she did not know much about the others. At that moment, Cheswick, who had been observing the situation, joined the conversation saying that the Stella organization must have different policies. And unlike most caretakers there, perhaps the members of Stella did not receive advance information about the caretakers who were already in the mansion. But he made it clear that it was only a personal theory, and then turned to Lynn asking if his theory was correct. Instinctively, Lynn confirmed Chezik's theory. And with that information, it seemed to make sense why the other caretakers were so offended that she did not know much about them. Even so, she felt no desire to make excuses or apologize. Whether they were acting out of envy or simply trying to deceive her, that was not the proper way caretakers should behave in front of their children. Our protagonist mentally concluded that those caretakers should be ashamed of themselves for letting their spite and prejudice cloud their behavior. While everyone waited for dinner to be served, Chezik asked Raven, the orange-haired caretaker, how he felt seeing Lynn in person, since clearly she did not seem to know him. Raven, clearly uncomfortable with the question, ended up spitting out a little of the wine that was in his mouth. Apparently, because before Lynn had arrived at the dinner, Raven had confidently said he had already heard about Lynn at the Stella Academy. Despite the scare, Raven tried to keep his composure, confirming that he had indeed heard about her. At that moment, Lynn remembered the conversation she had had in the afternoon with Cheswick and concluded that Raven was the caretaker who had come from Stella. Trying to confirm her theory, Lynn asked Cheswick if it was about Raven that he had been talking earlier. While she mentally wondered if by choosing the role of caretaker, the player automatically received a position as a member of the Stella organization. And if that were true, she would have to investigate further later. Lynn turned back to Raven and asked if he had really heard about her during his training. Clearly uncomfortable, Raven made an excuse that he thought he had heard her name somewhere, but that although they were both from the same organization, they were from different years. Clearly this guy was lying and must not have gone to any organization. But since someone supposedly from the organization had arrived, he had to come up with an excuse. At that moment, Vivi's caretaker interrupted the conversation to declare that it would be better if everyone introduced themselves properly. Seeing a way out of the unpleasant situation, Raven quickly agreed with the other caretaker. But our protagonist, as sharp as always, noticed that Raven was trying to dodge the subject of Stella. Yet since she was interested in learning more about the other caretakers, she let him off the hook this time. The information our protagonist received was not very revealing, but they were as follows. In room 1 resided Leska, a boy who gave off a cold and calm impression. His caretaker was none other than Marianne, the beautiful veiled woman with a chilling gaze who usually acted like a strict and overprotective mother. Manhwa lived in room number 2 and was a narcissistic, stubborn young man who got irritated easily. His caretaker was Cheswick, a handsome man, a little careless, and with a pleasant personality. In room 3, we have Vivi, a boy with a light and cute impression, as well as a friendly personality. His caretaker's name was Eugenia, an intellectual woman who was strict when it came to following rules. Leo was the angel of room number 4, a boy with a mischievous look and a bright, extroverted personality. Raven was his caretaker, but doubts still remained about his true origins, since he could not speak very well about his time at Stella. In room number 5, we have Sergio, who seemed very gentle and well-behaved. But his caretaker, Olivia, was his complete opposite, as she did not hesitate to cast sharp looks and show her dislike for elites. Jay was the child residing in room 6, and despite having an intelligent image, seemed strangely distracted. A quiet, simple, and honest man named Gilbert was his caretaker, and since he almost never spoke, he gave off a mysterious impression. Finally, Dien, the cutest and most adorable boy, lived in room 7. with his beautiful ruby eyes and shining silver hair. Our protagonist was his caretaker and had been forged to perfection through hours of sweat and tears shed. This was only a brief summary of what she had discovered, but Lin was sure she would be able to memorize everything as she spent more time alongside them. However, that might not even be necessary, because the glitch could be fixed sooner than expected, and she would never have to see them again. At that moment, the maids arrived with dinner trays, announcing that dinner would be served right then. Before lifting the lids of the dishes, one of them said that the main dish of the night was filet mignon with chimichurri sauce, and that the dinner had been carefully prepared to give a warm welcome, and so they hoped that everyone could enjoy the food. However, the instant Lin's dish was revealed, the servants were startled, and one of them even fell to the floor. Some maids trembled with fear and concern, questioning how that had ended up on the plate of the special guest. Other caretakers, including Chezik, seemed surprised to see a red flower on Lin's plate, the corpse flower. But Lin remained calm, a serious and cold expression on her face as she thought about the conditions in which that plant grew. But that was not a true corpse flower. It had not bloomed in the place where someone had passed away. Probably whoever did it had painted a white flower to scare the newcomer. Lin gave a mocking smile and declared that this was a funny way to welcome the new caretaker of the Redford mansion. Seconds later, she stabbed her fork into the flower with all her strength and immediately put it into her mouth, to the surprise of everyone around her. Olivia questioned in disbelief how Lin could have the courage to eat the flower. Chewing with relish, our protagonist asked, what was the problem with eating something that apparently the caretakers appreciated in the mansion? She added that she could not help but try something they had worked so hard to prepare. Lin poured water from her glass onto the flower that remained on her plate, revealing the white color of the flower, while thanking the author of such a prank for the excellent welcome gift. She then stood up, but before leaving, she revealed that she had tried hard to meet the expectations of the one responsible for the joke. After all, if she had simply ignored it, the prank would have been rather boring. But with a very satisfied expression, the young woman smiled and told them to wait for her turn to play. It seemed that round 44 was starting in a very interesting way, thought our protagonist. Shortly after, outside the mansion, everything seemed calm. 2 strong knocks were heard outside Diane's room. Seconds later, Lin entered the room, smiling. Diane was surprised to see his caretaker return so soon and asked if the welcome dinner had already ended. Lin only replied that she was worried he might feel lonely, and because of that, she hurried back. Internally, she thought that maybe she had come back a little too soon, but she was not willing to stay there and eat her meal after such an uncomfortable experience. Diane insisted that he was fine alone and that she should have spent more time at the dinner. With tears in her eyes, Lin said that she felt very lonely without him, making poor Diane blush. Changing the subject, she asked if Diane had already had dinner, but he did not answer and only looked away. Then she looked at the plate of food covered with a metal lid that had been left there for the young master's dinner. She approached the plate worried. If someone had altered even the slightest detail in Diane's dish, just like the prank she had had to face moments earlier, she would make that person bitterly regret it. But when she removed the lid and saw that the food was normal, Lin felt relieved. She then turned to him and suggested that the two of them have dinner together. This startled Diane, who asked why Lin had not eaten at the welcome dinner. Laughing nervously, she explained that she had come back early precisely so she could eat with him. Diane replied that he was not hungry, but that he would eat with Lin since she had asked. At that moment, the sound of a stomach growling echoed through the room, making Diane blush with embarrassment. The young master insisted that the noise had not come from his stomach. Smiling, Lin said that the sound had actually come from little kitten Diane, making the boy blush even more and ask her to stop calling him by those names. It was then that she revealed the 2 beautiful slices of cake she had brought, at the young master's request. He was pleased, and Lin said that Diane could eat both slices alone if he wanted to. He quickly refused and said that he had not asked for 2 pieces to eat them all by himself. Diane then took one of the slices, shifted its position, and after that moved it closer to the other, making them form a heart of chocolate and icing. The boy lowered his head, blushing, while Lin was still processing the meaning of that gesture. She then placed her hands on her chest to control her heartbeat in the face of so much cuteness. Happy, Lin asked if that was the reason the boy wanted 2 pieces, but he disguised it by saying he only wanted to see what it would look like if they were combined. He tried to be cute, asking what she thought of his cake art. Lin then hugged him, declaring how happy she was with his gesture. At first, Diane was surprised by his caretaker's closeness, but he soon smiled and returned the hug, saying that he felt the same way. Even after 43 first meetings, that had been the most meaningful one so far. The next day, in the maids' quarters, The bells rang and all the servants headed to the chapel. There, a priest invited them to pray together before another day of work. This was because Redford Mansion was a place where the servants followed a strict routine. Before breakfast, everyone had to turn to God and ask for his help in the chapel. After that, they were blessed with holy water, a ritual to purify the body and distinguish humans from moros. However, after the head maid had transformed, other maids began to wonder if the holy water was truly effective. One of the maids, who usually did not speak up, noticed that the atmosphere was tenser than usual that day. She found two of her colleagues talking in the hallway, commenting on the origins of the new caretaker of Room 7 and the possibility that young Master Diane might leave the mansion. Then, a maid known as Betty approached with a huge smile and greeted her, calling her Sarah Rosa. Betty asked what the new caretaker was like and if she was demanding, since Sarah Rosa was responsible for Room 7. Sarah Rosa said she did not know much, since Lynn had only been in the mansion for 4 days. Then the other insisted and asked if Lynn had already given her any orders, to which Sarah Rosa replied that she had not received any, apart from the request to borrow clothes because her suitcase had disappeared. As there was no interesting gossip, Betty left her and wished her to enjoy breakfast, leaving the green-eyed young woman disappointed. Apparently, she did not have many friends and always ate her breakfast alone. But for a few moments, she thought she was finally getting close to someone. Thus, she ate her meal quickly and hurried to fetch water for Room 7 because Lynn needed to wash. As she was heading to the new caretaker's room, Sarah Rosa had her jug of water taken away by a colleague. She questioned her colleague about what she was doing, and the other replied simply that Lady Marianne was waiting and thanked her ironically. Frustrated, Sarah Rosa replied that it was not fair because she had been the one to fetch the water, and Miss Lynn was also waiting. The other maid then explained that that was why she had thanked her. And she said that the green-eyed girl should not act as if something had been stolen from her, since everyone was taking care of each other in the mansion. In addition, the thief made it very clear that, despite there finally being a caretaker in Room 7, she should not consider herself on the same level as the maids of Room 1, thus revealing a work environment where cooperation was selective and based on unofficial hierarchies. After being left alone, Sarah Rosa lowered her head with a deep feeling of indignation. Then she thought to herself that there was an unspoken hierarchy among the servants. She reflected on the luck of the servants from other rooms, who wore ribbons around their wrists to represent their masters and pressure their colleagues. And she believed that her own luck had not been the best, since the only vacancy open when she arrived had been in Room 7. Moments later, Sarah Rosa arrived at Lynn's room and called for her, saying that she had brought the water. As she got no response, she knocked twice on the door and then decided to enter. When she opened the door asking for permission, a huge tablecloth was lifted by the wind and flew toward Sarah Rosa. Unable to dodge this sudden attack, she was wrapped in the cloth and lost her balance. However, before Sarah Rosa could fall, Lynn quickly stepped forward and pulled her by the waist, asking if she was all right. The maid, still a little perplexed, thanked her for having been saved from the fall. She looked more closely at the mysterious pink eyes and the friendly features of the caretaker of Room 7. Lynn looked back at her with a smile on her face. She pulled the maid closer, asking if she was all right, and apologizing for having left the windows open. Sarah Rosa said it was fine, and then quickly added that she had brought the water for Lynn to wash. Our protagonist then thanked her and began to wash her face. Sarah Rosa watched Lynn, thinking about how young and fragile she looked on the outside. And because of this appearance, some people in the mansion gossiped about whether she was really capable of fulfilling her duties as a caretaker. Noticing Sarah Rosa's gaze, Lynn turned to her and asked if there was something strange on her face. The maid, embarrassed for being caught, quickly answered no. Ashamed, she concluded mentally after analyzing from several angles that Lynn seemed like the kind of person one could trust. Our protagonist realized that today marked the 4th day she had been trapped in the game. Thanks to the lazy developers, she woke up again in the room in this clearly bug-ridden game. Thinking about it, she realized she had not noticed Sarah Rosa approaching because normally the system window would always appear, informing who was coming closer or what the schedule for the day would be. If there had been no error, at the moment Sarah Rosa brought the water, a mission window would have appeared and a mission would have begun. The mission would have been something like increasing the relationship with the staff who worked in Redford Mansion, with Sarah Rosa as the target of the mission and probably earning a bonus mission if she managed to become her friend. But Lynn was upset at not being able to enjoy the additional missions because of the glitch in the game. At least her days in the mansion seemed to be going well. Our protagonist had a very different view of what going well meant. Considering that at last night's dinner, it had become quite clear that someone in that mansion wanted her harm. She told us that washing her face with holy water every morning was part of the set of strange mansion rules, which were: Rule number 1. Since evil spirits and monsters inhabited the mansion, all staff and residents must wash their faces with holy water. Rule number 2. Upon finding a golden button stained with blood, do not pick it up. Instead, step on it with your right foot and walk away. Rule number 3. If a woman wearing a black veil appears in the hallway near the purple room and asks you something, do not answer. Rule number 4. Always close the windows when going to sleep. And if you hear a knock-knock coming from them in the middle of the night, do not open them anyway. Lynn knew that these strange rules served more as elements to heighten the horror atmosphere of the game than for any other reason. But it was necessary to be very careful, since failing to follow these rules several times could lead to decreased vitality and possible possession by evil spirits. The manual that listed these rules was originally in our protagonist's bag, which had disappeared. However, this was not the first time in the game she had already memorized all the rules. After this brief mental explanation, Lynn turned to the maid and thanked her for the clothes she had lent her. Sarah Rosa, shy, replied that it was nothing important and that if there was anything else she could help with, just let her know. But Lynn did not feel comfortable in that situation, since it seemed there was a distance between them and the two used-to-be colleagues. In her previous playthroughs, the two had been newly hired maids in the mansion and had a close relationship because they shared the same room. They even used to get scolded together, but they always seemed to find some reason to smile. And despite being in different roles this time, Lynn hoped they could continue to get along. Returning from her thoughts, Lynn asked if the caretaker's uniform she had found in the wardrobe had any special meaning, since the others had reacted strangely when they saw her wearing it at the banquet. Sarah Rosa then told her that that uniform was only worn on days when there were ranking ceremonies and evaluations for caretakers, or when someone was disqualified and expelled from the mansion. Upon hearing that, Lynn finally understood the hostile reaction of the caretakers when they saw her wearing the uniform during the dinner. But she grew curious about the ranking ceremonies, since she had never heard of that in the other times she had played. Sarah Rosa, who was observing Lynn, asked if by chance she had said something that bothered her, because as soon as she answered the caretaker's question, she noticed Lynn's face had been taken over by worry. But Lynn reassured her by saying that everything was fine. Although she was very curious about several new things that had only appeared after the glitch, Lynn knew it was not the time to focus on that, since she had to concentrate on fulfilling her duties. Because if everything was going as usual, today should be the start of the first plot of the game. As she walked down the hallway, she remembered that the first plot involved investigating the mysterious purple room. And besides that, on the player's 4th day in the mansion, the young master they were responsible for would develop a high fever, and the useless doctor of the mansion would give only a diagnosis of seasonal flu, prescribing only rest and water as treatment. Obviously, the fever would not go down and instead would only increase. With that, the player would hear about a strange rumor. The rumor said that at night it was possible to hear the sound of children's footsteps coming from the purple room, and in addition, it was reported that their protege had been seen in front of that room the previous night. Only the players would realize that something was wrong in that story, since they had remained by their young master's side all night. That is why the plot led the players to become curious and go investigate the purple room. Lynn knew that according to this scenario, Diane would begin to get sick that night. As someone who had played many times, the first plot was very easy for her. Even so, she hated the idea of seeing Diane fall ill again. However, there were many different factors in this new round, so things could develop in an unexpected way. As she walked down the hallway, she saw the golden button with the red stain and followed the mansion's second rule, stepping on it with her right foot. After that, she decided that worrying in advance would not help at all, so she would simply pay extra attention to the day's events and to Diane. Excited, she barged into Diane's room, saying good morning in a very energetic way. Diane was startled by the caretaker's sudden entrance. He complained to her, saying that she should knock before entering while quickly hiding something under the blankets. Lynn apologized, but the small scolding did not seem to affect her cheerfulness. But to Diane's misfortune, his caretaker's excitement was not enough to stop her from noticing that he had hidden something from her. Curious, she wondered what the young master could be hiding. Diane, noticing the curious look of his caretaker and defensively asking why she was staring at him. Despite her curiosity, Lynn's greatest concern was that there were many dangerous items in that mansion. And if Diane was in possession of one of those objects, it would be a big problem. So in response to her young master's question, she approached him, ignoring the small expression of panic on the boy's face. Determined to see what it was, Lynn grabbed the pillowcase of the bed, giving the excuse that she had seen a stain there. Diane, surprised, tried to hold on to the pillowcase while asking her to wait a moment. But Lynn insisted, pulling at the pillowcases while saying she would change them. Then she finally looked under the covers, discovering that Diane had hidden several peas wrapped in a napkin. At the moment he was discovered, he awkwardly explained that he had not set the peas aside because he hated them, but only because he wanted to eat them later. How cute, trying to give a flimsy excuse to our protagonist. And to confirm that he was telling the truth, he put one of them in his mouth. But despite his effort, it was very clear that he hated peas. Lynn watched him with a serious expression. Diane squeezed his eyes shut and made discreet grimaces while trying to chew the peas. Still, in vain, trying to convince his caretaker that he was not picky about eating. Lynn, in a very theatrical way, sat down beside Diane and said that if that was the case, then he should eat her peas as well. On hearing this, the poor boy had to struggle not to vomit. Lynn continued her little play, saying that even as an adult woman, she hated peas, and that she had begun to hate them even more because she had forced herself to eat them when she was a child, and that if she had not forced herself in the past, perhaps she would be able to eat them today. Lynn, with a gentler tone, told him that if he hated peas that much, it would be much better not to eat them. After all, it was wrong to turn his meals into a moment of displeasure. Diane then asked if she wouldn't be upset with him if he wasn't perfect. And with a smile, she assured him that she would not be upset, and that in fact, the reason she liked him was not because he was perfect, and that she thought he was an amazing person just the way he was, even with imperfections, so he didn't have to worry. Diane thanked Lynn for her words, and that gave him the courage to admit to her that he felt very happy to have her as his caretaker. The scene cut to the mansion corridors where maids walked hurriedly, probably busy. Lynn was standing in front of a window, full of energy and happy because Diane had said he liked her. Her happiness was so great that she greeted all the maids she met along the way cheerfully. She even fixed the bow of a maid named Tisha that was a little crooked. Lynn was loving being a caretaker. She had never gotten so close to her favorite character of the game. Before, she thought being a maid was the best role to get close to her favorite character, but being a caretaker was proving to be 1,000 times better in that regard. While Lynn celebrated the benefits of what she believed to be a new upgrade of the game, she stumbled upon a very uncomfortable scene. But before being seen by anyone present, she ran back behind the wall and hid. She watched the scene curiously, wondering if that was a new event. A maid was kneeling in front of the caretaker Marianne, begging for forgiveness and saying that it hadn't been on purpose, and that she would never repeat such a mistake again. But Luska's caretaker kept a cold and harsh expression as she looked at the maid. She then repeated the word mistake in a tone of contempt, and then slapped the maid in front of her, which left our protagonist very surprised. I love that Lynn has a gossipy spirit just like me. Marianne then started shouting, questioning how the maid dared to suggest that she grant forgiveness when the mistake could have put the life of her precious master in danger. Crying, the maid placed one of her hands on her cheek and said in a trembling voice, He wouldn't have died. Would... Marianne interrupted her, asking who had given her the right to make any statement. She continued, asking if she thought that switching the medications that Luska took every day could be considered a simple mistake. And her eyes began to shine with deadly fury as she said that the maid had a lot of courage to still speak after doing something so terrible. Lynn remembered that Luska was a character known for his fragile health and for falling ill easily. Maybe that was why Marianne was so furious with the maid. In a dark tone, Marianne said she would give the maid a chance to redeem herself. She then ordered that the maid be taken to the Abyss Flower Garden, declaring that she would grant forgiveness if the servant managed to spend the night in the garden without going mad. On hearing this, the maid became even more desperate, begging that her punishment be anything but that. She trembled like a pincher while screaming for forgiveness. Lynn found Marianne a little scary. She realized that she couldn't remember ever hearing about an Abyss Flower Garden. Meanwhile, the maid was dragged to the place with a look of total despair. Lynn, still hidden, decided to follow them because she still had plenty of free time. And her heart beat fast at that moment, which was one of her favorites, because it was a cliché of action in horror games. If she encountered any danger and needed to defend herself, she was carrying a hidden revolver. Besides, this game provided interesting battles that pleased her, and she was very eager for some action. However, while she was thinking how that situation was perfect to satisfy her preferences, she noticed a presence just a few pillars away. Looking to the side with a serious expression, Lynn made the person back away a little. Apparently, it was one of the mansion's children, and he had already been following Lynn all morning, ever since she left her room. Even when she was alone with Diane, she could feel that she was being watched by another boy at a distance. It seemed his caretaker allowed him to wander freely. But it was very strange for a boy to be out at that time, since they were usually busy with their lessons at that hour. Lin, however, did not care, and soon turned all her attention back to the expedition to the garden. For now, she needed to follow those maids carefully not to be seen. It didn't take long for our protagonist to find the three of them, and they looked so tense that it seemed like a moment of final farewell. But Lin didn't seem to care, because her curiosity outweighed any other thought. When the three reached the gate, Lin hid once again behind a pillar. The servant who was being punished was still screaming, calling for Lady Marianne. When Lin looked more closely at the gate, she was surprised. She had never seen those doors before. Meanwhile, the screams of the imprisoned woman made it all even more macabre. After closing the gates, the other two maids left as if nothing had happened. Thus, Lin had the chance to get closer for real, but she could not understand how such a terrifying place could be called a flower garden. And even when she got very close, Lin was not able to smell a single flower. In fact, that place gave off a dark and threatening vibe. Despite that, Lin did not feel intimidated because she was certain that place would provide her with new routes and new characters. And with that, she decided to enter the garden to take a peek. Seconds before Lin entered the garden, the boy who had been following her stepped out of the shadows, warning her not to go in there. The caretaker then turned with a big smile and greeted Minwell, the boy from room number 2, asking if he was also taking a walk through the mansion grounds. Minwell was surprised by the woman's calm reaction and greeted her back. Then he asked if she knew he had been following her all that time and why she had pretended not to notice anything. He also wanted to know if she had any idea of the place she was trying to enter. Lin confidently replied that it was clearly the Abyss Flower Garden. He could not believe that someone who knew what that place was would willingly enter it, and showed even more surprise when the caretaker asked if there was any problem. The boy then frowned and said that since she was an elite, she should have learned the basics about the mansion. He went on to say that judging by the way she knew he had been following her, he could assume she was trying to gauge his reaction. But that was a foolish strategy for a novice caretaker. But then Minwell's vision began to blur and his speech grew soft, as if that place was somehow affecting him. A strong dizziness overtook the boy and his voice faded away. Lin ran to Minwell's side as he collapsed to the ground after fainting. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward her. Then she supported his head in her lap, worried, while Minwell, still conscious and a little flushed, begged for help. As she held the boy's hands, she realized they were very hot, and that surprised her, reminding her of the game's first plot. Minwell was then taken to his room, and the doctor who was called to attend him said it was nothing more than a simple cold. Lin was a little confused, because those were exactly the same symptoms that Diane was supposed to develop during the first plot. Beside her was Cheswick, clearly anxious. The doctor said he would separate some medication, and they had to make sure the young master took it properly and also had to ensure he stayed well hydrated. Cheswick turned to him and thanked him for his work. Meanwhile, Lin was furious at the behavior of that quack doctor. She could not believe a man like that could be considered one of the love interests in the game. Worried, Cheswick leaned closer to Minwell and begged him to wake up, since Dr. Conrado had left a bit of medicine for him and he needed to take it. The man kept insisting, saying that even if it was difficult, he had to take the medicine. Then, with great difficulty, young Minwell slightly opened his mouth to take in a little of the medicine. As soon as he swallowed it, the boy began coughing heavily. His caretaker was becoming more and more nervous and pale, asking every moment if his protege was all right and begging him to keep his consciousness. With each passing second, Cheswick sank further into the chair, saying that if he had known this would happen, he would have been much kinder to the boy. Noticing her colleague's despair, Lin tried to calm him, saying that Minwell would be fine since he had taken his medicine and now only needed a good night's sleep to feel better. But Cheswick could not understand how he could have fallen ill so quickly. The man said he did not know a cold could reach such a bad level. This surprised our protagonist, making her ask if Minwell had never been sick with a cold before. To which Cheswick confirmed, saying that one of Minwell's strong points was that the boy was extremely healthy. Hearing this, Lin could not help but notice that Cheswick seemed to have a very harsh opinion about his protege. And even if this was Minwell's first time falling ill, Cheswick's reaction seemed very desperate. She would even say a little exaggerated. But Lin decided to set those thoughts aside, since she herself always had her heart broken when Diane fell ill. So she told him that she didn't think that was just a simple cold. She affirmed that possibly there was another reason for the boy being sick. Lin asked Cheswick if he had any idea what it could be. For example, if Minwell had been acting in an unusual way lately. The man said he wasn't sure, then asked the boy if he had heard what Lin had just said. Thus, our protagonist approached the sick boy's bed and asked if there was anything that could have caused such a sudden drop in his health. But Minwell said he didn't know what could have caused it. She gently asked him to think carefully and asked if he might have sneaked out of his room and done something in secret. Minwell just slightly averted his eyes while trying to deny it. Realizing that Minwell definitely must have done something, she asked if by any chance he had gone to explore the purple room. Upon hearing about the purple room, Minwell gave a start, practically confirming the protagonist's suspicions. Lin asked if by chance he had heard the rumors and had gone there to investigate. The boy then began to roll around in bed until he finally admitted it against his will. The rumors about the purple room usually started spreading around this point in the story, and each of the boys would sneak out in their own way to investigate that room. That was one of the parts that never changed. Except this time it was Minwell who fell ill instead of Diane, probably because of the system error. As soon as she heard the boy's confession, Cheswick asked Minwell if he had really sneaked out of his room during the night. The boy answered yes, which made his caretaker scold him for being reckless in going to investigate the infamous purple room. Minwell, embarrassed, began to explain in a bratty way that he had just heard the rumors and only wanted to be able to go and see with his own eyes. With that, Lin already had the information she needed, and she knew that if they kept arguing with the boy, the shame he was feeling, which was making his skin turn redder and redder, would end up making his fever worse. So she turned to Cheswick, saying it would be better for them both to leave the room so Minwell could rest. Cheswick sighed but agreed with her, but before leaving he warned Minwell that they would have a talk about it later. But before the two of them left the room, Minwell turned his face and asked them to place a new cold compress on his forehead. Minwell? Cute and always rebellious. I like him even though he picked on Diane at the beginning. Lin quickly noticed that Cheswick wasn't very good at handling such things, since he wanted to place a completely soaked towel on the boy's head. So she quickly offered to help him. Thus, she wrung out the excess water from the cloth and then placed it on the boy's forehead, who was strangely quiet. The two then left and closed the bedroom doors without making a sound. Once they were already in the hallway, Cheswick asked his colleague if Minwell would really be fine. To which she replied yes, since now that they knew the cause, they could look for a solution. Then she casually asked if he had any plans for that night. He first apologized, since he hadn't expected a question like that, and then answered that he had nothing planned. Knowing this, she then asked if he would like to visit the purple room with her at midnight. Cheswick was surprised by the unusual invitation. It sounded like an invitation to a haunted date. Lin, ignoring her colleague's surprise, proposed that they meet at the front doors of the other building at midnight. She confessed that she didn't believe cold medicine would be enough to cure Minwell. That was why they needed to investigate the most suspicious part of that situation and find a solution. Lin remembered that normally the player recruited one of the mansion NPCs to join them in this episode, and she usually always took her best friend Sarah Rosa. But due to the system error, she had been led to meet all these new characters and decided to try something new. Try something new, sure. The fact that Cheswick is sexy and wonderful has nothing to do with it. Don't feel guilty, Lin. I would do the same if I were you. Cheswick, hesitant, said they didn't even have the key to begin making any plan. But Lin confidently countered that they did have a key. She then revealed an old key, saying she had borrowed it in advance. Cheswick asked if the servants had let her take the key without questioning, but she corrected him by saying that, obviously, she had borrowed it without asking permission. At that moment, the caretaker of room 2 was left perplexed. Realizing Cheswick's expression, she regretted a little for having been so blunt, but stealing the key was the only way to complete that episode. Lin said that if Cheswick was still worried because of the rumors, he only needed to trust her, because she would protect him. Mentally, she was confident since she had gone through this episode 43 times. And even if the story unfolded a little differently, she could apply all her experience to overcome any obstacle. Cheswick thought for a moment and finally agreed, saying that it was fine and that he would meet her that night at the appointed time and place. Although the man seemed to have his nerves on edge, our protagonist was very excited to be able to experience the adventure in the annex building with a new character. At 10 o'clock at night, Lin went to young Master Dian's room, believing that nothing unusual would be happening. But when she reached the door and began to say it was time for bed, she noticed that her protege was not alone. She found 2 other boys there, Vivi from room 3 and Leo from room number 4. Leo then gave a mischievous smile and greeted Lin with a playful look. Although surprised, she was very happy to see Diane spending time with the other boys in the mansion. Since the other 2 boys also had to follow the same bedtime schedule, they had to say goodbye. Vivi then stood up, wished him goodnight, and said to Dian that they could continue their conversation the next day. Before leaving, the 2 boys approached Lin and said they would come back to visit soon. This pleased the caretaker greatly, and she replied that there was no problem with their return and told them to visit whenever they wanted. Then Lin wondered if that was how parents felt when they saw their children bringing friends home for the first time, and she began to look at her protege with even more affection. She joyfully asked if those two boys were his friends and if he had always received visits from the other boys, even before the caretaker's arrival. Diane answered, more or less, and that they were not that close. But Lin was more radiant than ever, since she had never seen the boy meet with friends, and she asked him to tell the others to visit him during the day so they could eat snacks together. But Diane, with a bit of jealousy, asked if by any chance she had become interested in them. Our protagonist, who had not understood the true meaning of that question, answered sincerely that she was very interested in the other boys. That left Diane displeased and surprised. So he shouted for everyone to hear that the other boys already had their caretakers and were on good terms with them. Besides that, they had already been in their company for about a year and were close enough that they would not be willing to separate. With a smile, Lin said that their relationship was very similar to the kind of affection the two of them had already developed for each other. Thus, she lightly touched the tip of the boy's nose and said that they two would stay together for a long time and would not separate. Those simple words were enough to make the boy blush like a tomato. But the moment he realized the expression he had on his face, he turned away and said that he was going to bed now. In this way, while the young master lay down with his face red, Lin wished him good night and asked him to sleep well. Then she left the room, satisfied that her boy was safe for that night. She felt a little sorry that Minwell had to fall ill in place of her protege. But since she and Cheswick would find the cure to make him better, her guilt was no longer so heavy. While walking outside the mansion, Lin ended up seeing an employee hitting on one of the maids. The maid said she was not interested and apparently had already rejected the man's advances more than once. However, he did not give up easily and insisted that she reconsider, saying he asked for nothing more than a simple walk at her side. According to the information our protagonist had gathered, that maid with black hair was known for her beauty and arrogance. And the guy hitting on her was none other than Raven, the lying caretaker of room 4. Their conversation went on for a while until the woman completely lost her patience and gave a hard kick to the man's leg, shouting that she was not interested and that he should leave her alone once and for all. The blow was so strong that the sound of bones breaking could be heard. The man turned paler than chalk, but even so, he asked the woman to wait as she declared she was leaving. At that moment, Lin started laughing, revealing her presence and making Raven feel even more embarrassed. But even so, he insisted that the maid, whose name was Sarah, was just being shy, and that in reality she liked him very much. In a mocking tone, Lin asked if that was why she had kicked his leg with such force, making Raven leave in a fury. Since the lights only went out at 11 o'clock, our protagonist would have to wait a while before she could start moving, without running the risk of being detected. And as soon as the moment came, Lin wasted no time and began heading to the meeting point. The hallways were so silent it seemed like the entire mansion was empty, except for Lin. Her heart beat fast at this sinister vibe she loved. Now she only had to meet with Cheswick. Our protagonist thought about going to get him personally in his room, but since she did not know where it was, she could only hope he would manage to arrive at the agreed place on his own. And inwardly, she made a mental note that she needed to do some reconnaissance patrols soon. Then Cheswick's unhappy face appeared in her thoughts, and she began to worry about the possibility that the man had decided to dismiss her. But she quickly pushed those thoughts away, as she believed Cheswick was not the type of guy who would let a young woman like her enter a ghost's lair alone in the middle of the night. He had been the only one to defend her during the welcome banquet, when everyone else seemed aggressive or distant. Besides that, when she passed by Minwell's room some time ago, the boy still looked very sick, and Cheswick was sitting by his bed, taking care of him. Lin was certain he would come even if only for Minwell's sake. As soon as she arrived at the entrance, she pulled the old key from her pocket and was about to put it in the lock when someone appeared behind her. She quickly turned around, for she was sure that presence was not Cheswick's. She immediately pulled out the hidden revolver and aimed it at the face of whoever was behind her. But in the end, it was only Raven, and he was already taking on a sickly shade of blue, trembling desperately. Terrified, Raven begged her to lower the weapon. But Lin did not move and kept pointing the gun at him, making Raven ask if she was really planning to shoot, and if she believed she could get away with a situation like this. With a dark expression, Lin said she would have no problem at all, since it was self-defense. Because Raven had followed a woman during the night and had even approached her from behind without permission. Raven then began sweating and growing even paler. Meanwhile, she thought that no NPC was capable of doing anything illegal against the player in that game, but since there was an unbearable bug at the moment, she could never let her guard down. Besides, as that guy was a new character who had not yet been properly verified and evaluated, it could not be said for sure what his true intentions were. And so she released the revolver's safety. Upon hearing the sound of the safety click, the man grew even more distressed and began shouting that it was all just a big misunderstanding. He begged Lin to calm down, saying he would explain the whole situation. Raven began to say that if she shot him at that moment, the caretaker would not be able to remain in the mansion because the others would not allow her to get away with such a situation. Then he asked if she really wanted her life to end that way. However, Lin revealed that she did not care about the others since they would not be able to control her. And as he was also from the elite, he should know how good she was. At that moment, she was also testing the man's reactions to discover his true origins, since she had doubted all his claims about coming from Stella for a while. And seeing how the man simply agreed immediately, Lin was filled with rage at that obviously deceitful attitude. Then he raised one of his eyebrows and asked if she had really participated in the elite training course. Lin countered with the same question, to which the man replied that he had also come from Stella and was only asking because he had never seen her there. Then, when questioned about why he had followed the new caretaker there and threatened again with the possibility of receiving a bullet through his head, the caretaker simply turned his head away with a slight tremor. However, as soon as our protagonist was distracted, wanting to know what he was trying to say with his few murmurs, the man grabbed her arm with both hands and tried to make her drop the weapon, saying that she was quite naive to think he would not be able to defend himself against a simple revolver. Lin was truly impressed by the boldness of the character in trying to fight back at a moment like that. But her fury spoke louder, and soon a twisted smile spread across her face. Immediately, she punched the man in the chin, a blow that must have hurt down to his soul. Then she stepped closer, stomping hard on the ground and calling him a weirdo. And she gave him a solid kick, throwing him out of there. Raven went bouncing across the floor until he finally collapsed. Defeated. Flat on the ground, he muttered that all he wanted was a simple date. Upon hearing those words, Lin grew even angrier and asked if it was with her that he planned to have a date. Raven quickly stood up and shouted that he would never want to go out with someone as violent as her, even if she begged him for a date. He explained that he had received a letter from the maid Sarah, asking him to meet her there at midnight. Our protagonist found all of that very suspicious, but she soon realized it was too late when a creaking sound echoed, followed by a loud bang. The doors of the annex building had shut, trapping the two caretakers inside together. The man then asked in distress why the doors had behaved that way. Grumbling, Raven said it was nothing, a little irritated at having to do the mission alongside Raven. Meanwhile, an old clock went tick-tock in the darkness, as if to heighten the tension of the atmosphere. Lin knew they were officially inside the dungeon now and would only be able to leave after completing the quest. And unfortunately, the NPC who would accompany her was that annoying guy from room number 4. At that moment, someone began forcing the annex doors from the outside. This made Raven scream and ask Lin who or what could be making all that noise. Annoyed, Lin told him to calm down because the noise was just Cheswick trying to get in. Cheswick lightly tapped on one of the windows, trying to see if he could enter. Then our protagonist spoke seriously, saying that both the doors and windows were locked. And since they couldn't be opened even from the inside at the moment, he would have to wait outside for now. Apparently, the man with glasses couldn't hear anything. So Lin started making every possible signal to try and send the message. Shortly after, he nodded in agreement, and our protagonist was satisfied that he had managed to understand her. After that, she ran off toward the stairs, and Raven shouted for her to wait for him, because he didn't want to be left alone down there at all. When the coward finally caught up with her, he said he couldn't believe she had agreed to meet Cheswick there in secret, because the two had just met, and he didn't know the blonde was so fast in those things. Lin only sighed and said not everyone was like the orange-haired man, asking herself why she had to end up stuck there with a jerk like him. At that moment, Raven turned indignantly and said he was no jerk. And besides, he didn't want to be stuck there with such a violent woman as her either. Lin said she wouldn't mind if he took another path, but the man quickly ran after her, asking her to wait, giving the excuse that he couldn't let a lady walk alone in such a dark place. Meanwhile, Lin thought about how Cheswick's look had turned strange when he saw her with Raven. He seemed much darker than usual, and she believed it was because he felt deceived and left out. After all, he had been called to the place and in the end ended up locked outside. Thus, Lin and her cowardly companion began walking through the corridors of the building. And while the man grumbled that he had terrible luck since all he wanted was a date with Sarah, our protagonist asked if he was sure that letter had come from her, since Sarah seemed to despise him. That left Raven even more indignant. And the caretaker said the newbie knew nothing about Sarah. because the very fact that the maid had invited him to meet her alone showed how good their relationship was, at least in his view. Then he gave a dreamy smile and said he understood why Lin thought that way, since Sarah really gave off a cold impression, but in reality, she was a very kind woman. Upon hearing those ridiculous words, Lin returned with a mocking smile, because a kind person would never invite someone to a date alone in a remote building known for its hauntings. While our protagonist held the lantern, she thought to herself that no one could say Sarah had good intentions when sending a letter like that. Realizing that the light was getting weaker, since Lin was moving away, the man snapped out of his daydreams and ran to catch up with his colleague. Then he asked Lin why she wanted to go to the Purple Room, since she surely must have heard the rumors about the place being haunted. However, she didn't answer, because her eyes were fixed on the main event of that episode. A woman completely dressed in black with a black veil over her face and surrounded by a frightening mist appeared in front of them. Raven was completely terrified at the sight, but Lin just let out a light sigh. Lin knew that woman was part of one of the mansion's rules, and that the rule said she should not answer the question of the woman in black in front of the Purple Room. Lin stared at the woman in black, reminding herself not to answer, and she hoped the woman would just move along and leave the two of them alone. But Raven had to ruin everything and start talking to the woman in black. He let out a sigh of relief, as if he had just met someone he knew, and asked what she was doing there and if everyone had agreed to meet there that night. The ghost stood silently, while he said he knew it was ridiculous that people claimed that place was haunted, revealing that he believed everyone was just scared after seeing the caretaker of Room 1, Miss Marianne, and had started spreading false rumors. Lin, realizing Raven wasn't very smart, warned him that the apparition in front of them was not Marianne and told him not to do anything stupid. But he gave her a mocking look and said it was indeed her, because he had known the woman for quite some time, and even though she was hiding her own face, he was certain. He then asked why she was looking for her boy and questioned whether Luska had run away. The woman asked again if he had seen her boy anywhere, and Lin, realizing Raven was about to answer, warned him not to say anything. However, he didn't care at all and said he hadn't seen him, besides asking how he could know if she herself had no idea. Seeing that it was already too late and there wasn't much else that could be done, our protagonist placed her hand on her forehead and hoped he would at least buy her some time. That's because in the original game, the player is cursed if they answer the woman in black 3 times. And upon receiving the curse, they begin to hear strange things and have hallucinations, as well as developing a great difficulty in breathing, making it much harder to obtain the item they are seeking in the Purple Room. Since Lin had planned to go to the Purple Room alone ever since she got stuck with Raven, she proceeded normally toward her target, leaving the man behind in a conversation with the ghost about whether she should give her boy a purple ribbon or a yellow hat. But since he wasn't giving any direct answers, the woman kept asking the same thing. Raven said she should give her boy both things, and the ghost continued repeating the question, until he finally said, with a tone of uncertainty, that maybe Luska would prefer the purple ribbon. Meanwhile, our protagonist reminded herself that the key she needed to enter the room was located under the purple candlestick to the right of the door. So, it didn't take long for Lin to find it. Meanwhile, the woman in black finally changed her question, asking Raven to remove the red flowers that were growing around her boy's body, making the man distressed and asking Lin if that woman really wasn't Marianne. Lin, focused on her mission, reminded Raven that she had warned him that this wasn't the caretaker of Room 1. Then she told him she was entering the Purple Room, asking him to wait outside and keep the door open. She also warned him not to answer any more questions from the apparition. Finally realizing the mess he had made, Raven answered Lin with an okay and asked her not to take too long. Upon entering the room, Lin told us that the Purple Room used to be occupied by one of the children who once lived in the Redford mansion. The boy had left this life very early due to a tragic accident, and there was a theory that the ghostly woman who appeared in front of that room was his mother. However, that was still uncertain, as it was only what other players had assumed. A few seconds after our protagonist entered, Raven appeared at the door of the room, telling her to hurry because the haunting continued to follow him everywhere. Lin didn't care much about those words because she wasn't going to take too long anyway. So she went to the dresser next to the bed, opened the drawer, and inside there was a small, well-decorated box. She took a small ribbon that was inside and told the caretaker of Room 4 that she was already finished. The man trembled as he stammered that they should both get out of there immediately. Meanwhile, the apparition was right at his back and insistently asked why the man wasn't answering anything she said. At that moment, Raven forgot the only duty Lin had told him to fulfill, which was to keep the door open, and ran away like a madman, screaming desperately and telling the spirit to stay away from him. Lin, with a furrowed brow, stood staring in surprise at the exit, since the man hadn't even been able to hold the door for a mere few seconds. And as a frightening mist spread through the inside of the room, Lynn thought to herself how useless that guy was. After getting rid of the objects that were emitting that frightening mist with several gunshots, Lynn opened the door and scolded the man, saying that she had asked him to keep the door open. He, however, was crouched in a corner of the corridor, paler than ever, saying he had no other choice because that ghost woman was following him everywhere. But he declared that he had done his best. Thus, ignoring the man's state, Lynn said she needed to stop by another place on the way, and warned him that he would have to hold out for at least 5 more minutes before he could leave the annex building. But at that moment, the woman in black noticed what our protagonist was holding and told her to return it immediately. Lynn already knew that the episode ended with a chase scene like that, but since it was only the first mission, it had a reasonably easy level. As the two of them ran, the ghost stretched out her hands in a strange way and said in her cavernous voice to return her little boy's ribbon. This made our protagonist feel strange because the way the apparition desperately chased her made Lynn feel like the villain of the story. However, she had no other choice, since that episode would not end until she returned the ribbon to the upper floor of the building, where the child who owned the ornament had left this world. When she reached the other floor, Lynn threw the ribbon onto the chrysanthemum flowers in order to be able to leave the building. The woman in black managed to reach her, screaming for her to stop, but it was already too late. With one last desperate no, her black veil fell, revealing her red hair as she tried to grab the last keepsake she had of her precious boy. But then a blinding light flooded the dark corridor and allowed our protagonist to clearly see the features of the ghostly woman. Amidst the tears was a beautiful woman, with gorgeous red hair and bright green eyes. She was an almost exact copy of the caretaker of Room 1. Then our heroine began to have visions of the ghostly woman's past with her beloved ward. She saw the ribbon he always wore with so much care and joy. She realized that the light that apparently always surrounded the boy and brightened his days suddenly turned into terror and darkness. And then she felt the woman's deep pain, who wept over the coffin of her sweet little boy, whose life had been torn away at the flower of his age. Afterwards, our protagonist rubbed her eyes a little, wondering if that was the video they usually played at the end of the episode, and noticing that it was different from the one she was used to. Then she picked one of the purple flowers and began to question the identity of the two people in the illusion. And while heading for the exit, she wondered if that was part of the new update. Going down the stairs, she met Chezik and asked what had happened to Raven. But she found out that her colleague had simply bolted like lightning as soon as the doors opened. Upon learning this, Lynn sighed and noted that Raven had really been very scared, even though he had only seen a few insects in the veiled lady. During the time she was assessing the situation, Cheswick unexpectedly approached. With her pink eyes, our protagonist looked at him, curious about what might come next. But she was surprised by the man's seductive tone, who seemed deeply dissatisfied at having been called there, only to be sidelined in the end. He asked if she wasn't a little too interested in Raven. Lynn was confused when she heard her colleague's words, since being interested in the caretaker of Room 4 was something that had never even crossed her mind. Cheswick, changing his expression, said, sounding sad, that he had overcome his fear of ghosts just to meet her. But in the end, everything had been in vain, because when he arrived at the place, he saw her having fun alone with Raven. Lynn was surprised by Cheswick's interpretation and asked if he really believed the two of them had been having fun, since the experience of that night could be called anything but fun. Then she explained that she hadn't invited the caretaker of Room 4. They had only run into each other by chance since Raven had come to meet someone else. She took the opportunity to ask if anyone else had shown up outside while Cheswick was there. The man replied that he hadn't seen anyone but himself, making Lynn laugh scornfully as her theory was correct, and the maid had lured Raven there to play a trick on him. With a proud air, she extended a flower and said that, although things hadn't gone as planned, she had achieved her goal and that he should take the plant to Manhwa so that he could get better. Cheswick then asked with a bit of disbelief if the only thing he had to do was take the flower to the boy, to which she replied yes, and that Manhwa would be fine by morning, as long as he slept with the flower next to his pillow. With a serious expression, she asked if he had ever heard anything related to the ghost that haunted the annex building. He thought for a moment, but said he hadn't heard much. But Lynn insisted, asking if she was wrong to believe that people talked a lot about this subject in the mansion. Cheswick confirmed, but explained that, as he had mentioned earlier, he was afraid of ghosts, so he didn't like to listen to those conversations. This really surprised Lynn, as she thought he had been joking when he mentioned that earlier. He assured her that he would never have come to the annex building at midnight if she hadn't asked him so insistently. Even so, she was still unsure if he was being serious or not, but since he had such a serious appearance, it would have been rude to keep insisting. Chezik then took Lin's hand, and with a smile he said they should hurry, since Minwell was probably waiting. In no time they were back at the main building, but only Cheswick entered room number 2. He called for the boy, waking him up. Still drowsy, Minwell asked what his caretaker was doing there so late at night, to which the man replied with a mysterious smile that he was there, obviously, to help him feel better. Minwell turned over in bed, saying that nothing he brought would help him, since it was probably something he got on the expedition with the new caretaker. At that moment, Cheswick, lifting a brown suitcase, said seriously that he already knew, so there was no need for the boy to repeat those words again. He then asked if the boy recognized the object he was carrying. Minwell quickly sat up, surprised that the suitcase was in Chezik's hands. Clearly worried, he asked how his caretaker had found out about the suitcase. Removing his glasses, Chezik said that was a very foolish question and asked if the boy really thought he could deceive him. Minwell swallowed hard as he looked at Lin's suitcase, which he had initially hidden just to play a prank on her. He did this because he was upset that the caretaker had said she had never wanted to choose him. But as he carried on with that prank, Minwell began to feel guilty and very anxious. Even so, he had been unable to return the object to her. Realizing he had been caught, he explained that he had only been trying to play a prank on the novice. With an expressionless face, Chezik remembered that he had heard that, on the day Lin arrived at the mansion, the boy had asked her to be his caretaker, which upset him, since he didn't know Minwell was unhappy with him as his caretaker. He quickly explained that he wasn't unhappy, and had only said that to annoy Diane. But Chezik leaned toward his ward, asking if he wanted to be expelled from the mansion. And he went on complaining that it was irritating enough for the boy to get in his way, but now he was even resorting to theft and lies. The man put his finger on Minwell's forehead and gave a light push, making the boy lie down again. Cheswick revealed that it was because of such pranks that he was being punished that way. In his thoughts, Cheswick was intrigued by the fact that Lin thought Minwell was sick because of the ghost in the annex building, but that was just a misunderstanding, since the boy was being punished for acting against the mansion's rules. He scolded the boy, asking why he always acted so rashly when he knew he could die. And he questioned whether he believed that, as his caretaker, he could fix things again somehow. Minwell turned to Cheswick and asked the man to go easy on him, to which the adult replied that he had already gone easy far too many times. However, he didn't continue with the lecture and instead gave a smile. Placing his hand over the compress that remained on the boy's forehead, Cheswick said he would let this one pass for the last time because he was starting to get bored and had even thought of giving up his position. But apparently things were about to get more interesting from that moment on, and that reinvigorated him. Finally, he was very clear in saying that if the boy got into trouble again, he would not let it slide under any circumstances. Minwell nodded positively, indicating that he would behave. At that moment, Cheswick took the purple flower that Lin had given him earlier. He explained to the boy that it was a gift from the caretaker of room 7, but since Minwell didn't need it, Cheswick asked to keep it for himself. The bedridden boy made no objection. While appreciating the pleasant scent of the flower, Cheswick thought that his boring life in the mansion was about to become interesting. The next morning, Sarah Rosa woke Lin with great excitement because a suitcase had been left at the caretaker's door, and the maid wanted to know if that was the lost suitcase. Our protagonist immediately recognized her belongings, and Sarah Rosa was very pleased because she felt guilty about the loss of the suitcase and said that someone must have found it and done the good deed of returning it. Thus, with a radiant smile, the servant revealed that she was very happy because she knew Lin had gone through a tough time in those past few days. The new caretaker agreed and thanked the maid for always being so thoughtful, saying that she could finally return the clothes she had borrowed. But Sarah Rosa said it was nothing and that she felt honored to be of some help to the caretaker of room 7. Those words left Lin a little embarrassed because the maid spoke as if it were a great honor to lend her own clothes to one of the caretakers. Apparently, the position of caretaker really did bring great status in that mansion. As soon as she was alone, Lin opened her suitcase and was very pleased to finally be able to read the game's manual. However, she found it strange that the cover of the book was so tattered, as if it had already been used before. But that didn't matter, because what was written inside would help her a lot. It contained many important points, such as the objective of Redford Mansion, its rules, the daily routine of the staff, and even the emergency protocol. Lin didn't spend much time on the introduction and flipped straight to the next part, because apparently it had the same information as in her previous playthroughs. Moreover, the part she wanted to see and needed the most was the introduction to caretakers. And being able to discover vital information about the caretaker's duties, after so many days in the dark, brought a sense of profound relief and revived her spirits. Now, with the book in hand, she was finally about to discover more about what a caretaker did. The first part of what the caretaker's role in the mansion was explained, that Redford Mansion housed 7 chosen children, and as a caretaker, Lynn should protect her child from all dangers until he became... But the final objective was covered by an ink stain, and that the caretakers should remember that the mansion, which was not a simple building, was always watching their steps. As the book was old and stained with ink, Lynn focused on the parts she could read completely. According to the manual, the ward should grow in a balanced way, both physically and mentally. Academic grades, physical training, and etiquette classes were equally important in this learning environment, and that's all regarding the increase of the character's statistics. Next came the caretaker's rules. The first warned not to disclose any information learned from the organization to their boy. The second said that causing physical harm to their ward, except for disciplinary purposes, would result in the loss of points. The third stated that, monthly, an evaluation would be carried out regarding the achievements of the caretakers and their boys. If considered below the expected standard, they would not be allowed to remain in Redford Mansion. And the fourth rule ordered caretakers to observe their angel daily and keep a diary. These records could even be considered in the ranking evaluation. Lynn then stopped reading for a moment to put her thoughts in order, and she was satisfied to finally understand what the monthly evaluation and the ranking system were about. The idea of being expelled if she wasn't considered qualified weighed heavily on her shoulders, and upon finishing reading the fourth rule, Lynn was surprised about the need to write a daily observation diary. That was because if she wrote an observation diary about Diane, it would almost certainly turn into a fangirl diary. In other words, she would talk much more about the boy's cuteness than about anything else. After assessing the new information, Lynn came back to herself and realized it was time to go to young Master Diane. Thus, she left the manual behind and immediately went to prepare so she could accompany him to breakfast, which had an appearance and probably a smell and taste that were incredible. During the meal, Diane looked at Lynn and casually commented that she was eating in a hurry that day, asking if she was really hungry. Lynn, who seemed to have just woken up from a dream, showed surprise at hearing her name, since apparently she hadn't been paying much attention. And the reason our protagonist was acting this way was right in front of her. But Lynn simply blushed and said nothing, since she would end up calling her ward a prince by accident. That was because Diane was wearing a white shirt with blue ribbons, paired with suspenders, making him look absolutely adorable. In addition, he had tied his hair up high to keep it out of the way for his violin lesson, which was a refreshing change. But most importantly, with his hair pulled back, Lynn could clearly see Diane's cheeks puffing like those of a hamster as he chewed, which was unbearably cute. She thought that if she spoke honestly, Diane might think she was strange, so she forced herself to hide her feelings. As an answer to his question about her rushed attitude, she said she had somewhere to go after breakfast, so she must have unconsciously sped up her bites. Diane asked where she would be going, and Lynn explained that Manuel had been very sick the previous day, so she wanted to check if he was feeling better now. Lynn was planning to see if Manuel had slept beside the flowers she had brought from the annex building, and to find out if this method worked in this playthrough of the game, even with all the differences in the story. Thus, Diane asked in surprise about Manuel being sick, questioning how that had happened and if he had gotten hurt playing outside, seeming genuinely shocked to learn that Manuel was unwell. Lynn explained that it wasn't an injury like that, but that he had a high fever. Diane found it strange, saying that the blonde boy had never caught a cold and that he had always thought Manuel's best trait was his health. Well, one of his best traits, anyway. Lynn thought that Diane had subtly criticized Manuel, just like Chesak had the day before. If two people thought this way, Manuel must have normally been really resilient. Then, with a determined voice, the young master asked to go with her to room 2 after breakfast. Lynn was surprised at her boy's attitude, but she said that he was very kind and adorable for wanting to visit a sick friend, and commented on how Diane was already so grown up. When called adorable, the young master began to blush slightly, and he retorted that she really said things like that without thinking twice and with such ease. Lynn replied that it was all true and that he should already know she couldn't lie about how she truly felt. Diane then blushed again, his ears turning red with embarrassment, and said that he had no way of already knowing such things. Meanwhile, the angel of room 7 clenched his shorts tightly to maintain a respectable posture. After they quietly finished their meals, Diane and Lynn went together to Manuel's room with a beautiful bouquet of roses. Seeing them, Manuel asked what they were doing there and why they were bothering him so early in the morning. Diane said he had come to visit him after hearing he was sick, but said that the blonde boy already seemed perfectly fine now. and Lin, believing it was all the work of the flower, was very satisfied. Manuel then asked about the flowers in the bouquet, and Diane explained that he had brought them as a get-well gift since Manuel was sick, though it seemed unnecessary now. When the blonde boy looked more closely and noticed a purple flower, he shouted in an exaggerated way, surprising both visitors. Manuel had remembered the purple flower that Lin had sent him the night before, and how Chezik had shown interest in the plant. Apparently, that had some deep effect on the boy. Manuel had a sickly look when he exclaimed that he hated purple flowers and that they were the worst. There was only one purple flower in the bouquet, but it seemed to be the only thing Manuel could see. Perhaps he had had a bad experience in the Annex's purple room and now reacted sensitively to anything that reminded him of it. The problem was that Diane, unaware of the situation, grew angry at Manuel's words, saying that he had gone out of his way to bring that, and that there was no need to scream like a madman. Thus, since the blonde boy didn't accept the gift, Diane showed that he wanted to keep the bouquet. Lin thought they were going to fight again, as it seemed like lightning bolts were being fired from their eyes. Feeling the need to intervene, Lin changed the course of the conversation, asking where Chezik was, since he had headed to room 2 the moment they stepped into the main building. But Manuel was rude and asked why he should care about the whereabouts of the caretaker, saying the man was probably in his room. For some reason, Diane turned to Lin with wide eyes after hearing her question, asking how she knew that detail about Chezik. And Lin explained that because of Manuel's fever, they had met briefly and then returned to their respective rooms. He said he understood, but that he thought she had already gotten closer to that other caretaker. Lin then wondered if he was jealous again. In this 44th round, her boy might have seemed more prone to anxiety and jealousy. Thus, before Diane could start worrying about unnecessary things, she reassured him, telling him not to worry and that no matter who she got close to, he would always be her number one. Manuel, who thought that was far too sappy, told them to stop being so disgusting in front of him and threw them out of room 2. With no regard for the mansion companions, the angel of room 2 shoved the visitors out and slammed the door shut. Diane grumbled about what Manuel's problem was and how ungrateful the blonde was, since he had treated so poorly the people who had come to visit him to check on his health. He commented that even if the two of them were candidates for the X position, he simply couldn't understand Manuel's personality, although he also didn't like thinking badly of others. Hearing Diane's words, Lin felt a strange sense of discomfort, since the name of the position had been censored. Thus, thinking she had simply misheard, she asked, a little anxious, about what he had just said. Diane asked what she wished to know, and Lin said the boy had spoken about some kind of candidate. Then the young master repeated the same words as before, but even so, our protagonist still couldn't understand what kind of candidate he was referring to. Diane then looked at Lin with a confused look. His expression was innocent, but Lin was sure she had heard something strange in his words. It sounded like a noise or a strange pronunciation, as if the boy were mumbling. At first, she thought she was hearing wrong, but now she was certain she wasn't. What was happening was that whenever the boy tried to say the forbidden word, a strange sound got in the way. Thus, Lin thought for a while to try to understand what was happening. But since she had duties to fulfill, she decided to set the matter aside for now. With that, she decided to take her beloved ward to the place where he would have his morning lessons. The day was radiant and the classes were about to begin, when the young master of room 7 began to get lost in thought. Vivi soon commented with a curious tone about Dian once again isolating himself in a corner, thinking deeply. The boy was so focused that he seemed to be part of a different world, as his mind carried him further and further away from the classroom. Manuel told them to leave him alone, judging from his expression that Dian was probably thinking about his new caretaker. At that moment, Leo began to express his envy, saying that he also wanted a beautiful caretaker and complaining about Raven's looks and behavior, who acted very much like an old man. The children's conversation brought Diane back to reality, and noticing the situation, he quickly changed his expression. He looked at his classmates, asking them to be quiet and explaining that he was just enjoying the sunlight coming in through the window. The children smiled ironically at him, teasing that this was why he had asked for opinions about what gift to give his caretaker. Unable to bear the teasing, Diane looked even more seriously at his friends and shouted for everyone to be quiet, since the teacher would be there soon. Minutes later, they were all seated properly, following the lesson. Although Diane's thoughts were consumed by the feeling of familiarity he had with Lin, even though she had only been at the mansion for 1 week, the young boy managed to pretend he was reading the book attentively. But the same could not be said for Leo, who was sound asleep. When the silver-haired angel rested his head on one of his hands, he began to wonder if this feeling of already knowing his caretaker for centuries was due to the gentle way he was always treated. and Diane still couldn't believe that his first caretaker was someone like Lin. He almost felt afraid of this situation, as it all seemed too good to be true, especially because before Lin's arrival, he had been on the verge of being expelled from the mansion, since his deadline to get a caretaker would end on his birthday that year. Lin appeared exactly when Diane was about to give up on everything. And when he first heard that a caretaker would be assigned to room 7, he thought he was dreaming. When he found out that one of the possible caretakers had chosen him, he was so excited and nervous that he couldn't even remember what he was doing while waiting for Lin's arrival. Hearing the rumor that Diane had finally gotten a caretaker, the other boys became curious, and one of them went to visit him to talk about it. It had been Manhwa, one of the most popular children among the possible caretakers of Redford. He went to Diane and began boasting, offering advice and saying it was important to be strong from the beginning. That was because if the children acted too obedient and pleasant, they would give the impression of being weak and then would not be chosen. Thus, the blonde insisted he had to show he was strong, no matter what. Diane didn't fully believe him, but a small part of him was tempted to follow since Manhwa was indeed popular among the caretakers. So, when the caretaker arrived, he tried hard to hide his nervousness and act indifferent. He acted as if she were just another servant and he a demanding master, when Lin was actually his savior and last hope. In truth, he wanted to run to the caretaker, thank her for choosing him, and cry until his eyes were dry for having waited so long. But he feared that if he did, she might grow tired of him and leave on the very first day. So he held back his tears and hardened his gaze. It was the same when he hurt his ankle. Diane feared that Lin might be disappointed in him for getting injured so carelessly on the very first day. But instead, she showed concern for him, asking how he could have gotten hurt in such a short time. And even with something as simple as the story of the peas, the caretaker chose to stay by his side and understand how the boy felt. The angel of room 7 was deeply happy and grateful to have Lin as his caretaker. And clenching his hands tightly, he hoped that she would like the gift he was preparing. Later that day, while taking a break from her tasks, Lin used her free time to visit Chezik's room. Arriving in front of the quarters, she knocked twice on the door, asking if Mr. Chezik was inside. However, our protagonist received only a resounding silence as a response. Lin wondered if he had gone out, as she wanted to ask to see Chezik's manual, if he had one. That was because she wanted to check if the caretaker's manuals were the same as hers. That is, full of letters she was unable to read. It seemed the door wasn't completely closed, but even so, our protagonist hesitated to enter out of politeness, despite him being only an NPC. But not a second had passed when she contradicted herself and opened the door upon hearing something fall and break inside. However, Lin froze like stone when she saw the situation she had stumbled into. Chezik was sitting on a sofa, half reclined against the backrest. And right in front of him, leaning over the man with one hand, was a woman. That woman, with short black hair and seductive beauty, was without a doubt the maid whom Room 4's caretaker was always hitting on. The one famous for being cold and beautiful. While Lin remained with a lost look, Chezik asked what had brought her to his room. Lin quickly said it was nothing and apologized for interrupting. She immediately took a step back and closed the door, retreating outside. Lin thought to herself about how surprising that was. Although it wasn't unheard of for the game's characters to have romantic relationships in the story, this was quite shocking. Chezik and that arrogant maid were an unexpected pair, but maybe she liked nerds. At that moment, someone appeared in the hallway speaking loudly. It was the caretaker of room 4 who, after a sigh, said he was looking for Lin. But despite his urgency, he hesitated to speak. His face looked thin and tired, as if he hadn't closed his eyes the entire night. Then he asked to talk for a minute, probably about the previous night. Lin said she was busy, and that if he had something to say, he should say it quickly. Only after Lin pressured him did room 4 finally open his mouth, asking if that thing from the night before hadn't been a dream. Our protagonist then asked if he was talking about almost getting shot in the annex, or when he got scared of a ghost and ran away alone. His skin was already pale with dark circles, and he seemed to be in denial about the events of the previous night. But upon hearing her, Raven finally accepted it. Thus, he murmured in shock that he was really living in a haunted mansion. Lin suggested that, if he was curious, he could return to the annex building that night because maybe the woman was still there and he would be able to check again. At that moment, a soft voice called Lin's name from behind. She hadn't noticed that the door had been opened, and because of that, she turned suddenly. Chezik was staring intensely at her with a disappointed expression. While he asked why she had left the room without revealing what she wanted, our protagonist thought about how careless she had been to forget that they were still standing in front of Chezik's room. The man then wanted to know if she had come to see him, or if she had interpreted the situation the wrong way. The caretaker confirmed, but quickly cut off what she was going to say. Lin wanted to answer properly, but she couldn't say that she had left the room so as not to disturb his moment with the maid Sarah. Then the door opened a little wider and the maid who had been with Cheswick came out into the hallway, leaving Raven shocked. The caretaker of room 4 immediately asked why the woman was leaving Cheswick's room, and then assumed a furious expression, questioning his colleague about the relationship between the two. Oh no, is it a misunderstanding? Cheswick is all mystery. I don't think he's the good guy type, but I don't know if he's the villain type either. Raven grabbed Cheswick by the shirt and asked once again why Sarah was in his room, declaring that the man only remained in the mansion out of pure luck. But despite all that commotion, the maid slipped away without a care for room 4, who was still smitten with her. Before the servant disappeared, Lin had the impression that the brunette had shot her a cold glance, and our protagonist hoped that the maid wouldn't think she had interrupted their moment on purpose. Meanwhile, Cheswick's voice sounded so indifferent it almost seemed bored, questioning why yet another maid would enter a room. This seemed to provoke Raven, who suddenly exploded with anger. Lin, however, was enjoying the drama from outside the conflict zone while thinking that Cheswick was no pushover. In the meantime, Cheswick's hand had caught Raven's with his long, pianist-like fingers, and the blonde's lips tightened as he stared at Raven and explained that the woman had entered the room only to carry out her cleaning duties. The caretaker of room 4 repeated the word cleaning in disbelief, while Lin wondered if that could really be called cleaning. The blonde's expression and tone were so dry and emotionless that they made Raven, who had misunderstood the situation and kept asking for confirmation that the two had nothing, look like the one in the wrong. The orange-haired man said Cheswick should have explained that from the beginning instead of letting him misunderstand. But the caretaker of room 2 replied that Raven had jumped to conclusions and gotten upset on his own. Thus, room 4 admitted that he had made a mistake, and Cheswick said that the most important thing was to know why Lin had come to his room. For that reason, he turned to the novice with a smile, asking if she would like to enter his quarters. Lin immediately replied no, since she probably couldn't forget the position in which he and Sarah had been just a few minutes earlier. The man with glasses then let out a strong and sad sigh, as if preparing to repeat an unnecessary explanation. Cheswick commented that her decision had been a bit too quick and that it hurt his feelings. He asked if she had also misunderstood, explaining that the maid had come in to clean and was only waking him up at the time the caretaker had entered. Lin said with a radiant smile that she understood, but that he didn't need to explain anything to her. And that made the caretaker comment on how cold her attitude was. Cheswick explained that he had broken a glass earlier, and since there might still be some fragments scattered around, it would be better if she didn't come in. So our protagonist took advantage of the course of the conversation to say that she had only come to borrow the manual and that she wasn't in a hurry. Upon hearing the young woman's words, the caretaker of room 2 fell silent for a few seconds while observing her with an empty expression. Then, with his head lowered, he asked what this so-called manual was, and Lin explained that it was a book containing details about the mansion. Cheswick said he hadn't received anything like that, and Raven, who was still nearby for some reason, interrupted by asking what they were talking about. The orange-haired man confidently said that everyone received a guide before entering the property, and therefore the blonde should have one as well. Raven's suspicious eyes turned to his colleague, who said that now that Raven mentioned it, he thought he had received something like that a long time ago, but must have forgotten over the months. And Raven grumbled that it had only been a year since Cheswick had only arrived a few months before him. As expected, the caretaker of room 2 ignored him and spoke to Lin, saying that if she checked, it might be somewhere in his room, but asked why she needed it. Lin explained that the back of her book was torn, so she wanted to borrow one from a colleague. Thus, Cheswick said he would start looking, but Raven cut Cheswick off, offering to lend his own. That was because he had memorized everything and no longer needed it. So Lin asked to borrow the manual for a while, since it didn't matter whose book it was. After room 2 pulled a grim face, Raven asked if they were done there, calling Lin a rookie and saying they would continue the conversation about the previous night. He commented that he still had something to say about the experience in the annex building, and that was why he was still hanging around. Lin then said that it was fine and said goodbye to Cheswick. In any case, she had managed to get someone to lend her the manual, so there was no reason to stay any longer. When her colleague from room 2 said goodbye, his gaze was dark and fixed on Raven. At that moment, the coward began to feel a strong chill down his spine, and Lin asked if the man simply wasn't weak, to which he replied that he wasn't weak at all. As soon as Lin moved away from Cheswick and the two began to walk down another hallway, Raven told her not to get too close to that guy. Lin asked why, questioning what it mattered to him whom she approached. And Raven replied that he was only saying that because she was new and seemed to have no notion of certain things. What Room 4 said next about the friendly caretaker of Room 2 was truly surprising to our protagonist. He stated that the only talent that Guy had was being lucky, and despite seeming nice, Chezik was not trustworthy. In addition, he revealed that in his opinion, it was only a matter of time before he was expelled from the mansion. When the fool commented that Chezik was a loser compared to elites like them, Lin was very bothered, since she already knew he hadn't gone through any special training. So the caretaker told him to stop trying to sympathize with her. And she looked at the man coldly, stating that she had no interest in being grouped in the same category as him. He seemed genuinely offended, asking if she was seriously on that loser's side, and reminded her that they had gone through that terrifying ordeal in the annex the night before together. To which Lin replied that he had run away alone to save himself, questioning if that bond had any value. Raven tried to defend himself, saying that he hadn't run away, but he wasn't able to come up with any decent excuse to prove his story. In the end, he changed the subject, saying that he had almost forgotten an important warning because of that loser Chezik. Thus, he asked Lin not to mention the ghost they had seen in the annex to the lady in Room 1. His words caught Lin off guard. She was intrigued, asking why not and if there was any connection between them. But the man only insisted that she not mention it, then offered her his manual. Before closing the door, Raven quickly tossed the guide to Lin, telling her to remember what he had just warned. But our protagonist didn't care about the warning and only thanked him for the tip, since as a professional gamer, she was always chasing new thrills. The next day, Lin went out to the garden and greeted Marianne, calling her Lady of Room 1. Marianne, who seemed to have gone out for a walk and some tea, turned her head at the sound of Lin's voice, asking what she had just called her. Lin repeated Lady of Room 1 and asked if she was acting inappropriately. But the veiled woman did not answer, making it clear that she had no interest whatsoever in dealing with Lin. But our protagonist couldn't give up since she needed to uncover more details about the game's story. So when Marianne stood up, Lin asked if she was strolling with the maids because the weather was nice, and commented that it had been a while since she had seen the maid that Marianne had sent to the Abyss Flower Garden, which made the maids behind Marianne shrink back. Lin asked if the servant had failed to return, or if they simply hadn't met yet by coincidence. But the caretaker of Room 1 remained in complete silence. Of course, our protagonist wasn't the type to get discouraged easily, so she followed her as if she were on a leisurely walk, until the rookie asked bluntly if Marianne had ever heard about the purple room in the annex. When she commented that the staff said a woman with a black veil appeared in that hallway and that her hair was red, the caretaker of Room 1 stopped immediately. The woman began to turn slowly while asking what Lin had just said. Our protagonist was very happy to see that she had finally gotten some reaction out of Marianne and decided to keep provoking her. Lin said that she had actually gone to the annex recently and seen everything with her own eyes. Marianne then asked, as if the rookie's testimony were more reliable than the others, if Lin had really seen the apparition. Our protagonist confirmed that yes, explaining that she had heard the rumors about the annex and, out of curiosity, went to take a look. But there really was a ghost. When it comes to games, aggressive strategies are always the answer. So Lin did not hesitate to go straight at Marianne. Of course, in real life, this wouldn't work, but they were inside a game after all. And going slowly in the investigation would not help her at all. And since it was obvious that there was an interesting secret about to be uncovered, Lin decided to keep snooping around to get new reactions from the character. Lin then asked if Marianne knew about the rumor of children's footsteps in the annex, which made the maids very uncomfortable. At the moment, the protagonist revealed that the child responsible for the noises supposedly had black hair. Something long and snake-like flew toward her. Then, a cold voice reached her ear, saying that the rumors about her being from Stella were really true. Since Lin had blocked Marianne's whip without any effort, Lin thought that this woman was really different, since few people use a whip on others without hesitation. Then she said that she was being too harsh, as she could have caused her a serious injury. Marianne then asked if no one had taught Lin not to mention the previous pair of Room 1 in front of her, to which the rookie replied that she had never heard of such a thing. At that moment, the whip that was tightening around Lin's hand loosened and slipped back to the ground. The redhead praised the protagonist's act of pretending to be innocent, but said that if the rookie thought she could provoke her with that kind of talk, she was very wrong. Then she cracked the whip against the ground threateningly. She said that she used to have high hopes for the caretaker of Room 7, but was disappointed to discover her true level. But our protagonist continued to claim that everything she said came from her experience in the annex building, and assumed that the previous pair of room 1 must also have been formed by a red-haired woman and a black-haired boy. Marianne's expression tightened at Lynn's words, since the woman could not stand the fact that the newcomer acted as if she knew nothing because of an unusual policy from the Stella organization. The redhead noted that others might be fooled by the girl's innocent smile, but she didn't trust Lynn one bit and knew her story was obviously false. At that moment, the caretaker of room 7 gave a mischievous smile, showing her satisfaction at finally dealing with something spicier and sharper. After all, in this game, it's all about trolling. Then Lynn heard the sound of someone approaching through the bushes and waited in anticipation to see who it was. Seconds later, young Master Luska approached, even though the maids begged the boy to stay away from the two caretakers at that moment. But the angel paid them no attention and asked with all the calm in the world if the two were fighting. The appearance of a child as innocent as Luska made the two women not know what to do or say, until Lynn broke into a wide smile and said that the two were just greeting each other. Then she asked if he had been reading nearby, since she believed Marianne had gone out alone, but apparently she was there to watch over him. The caretaker of room 1 let out a sigh of impatience and said that she had already warned Lynn not to get close to Luska. She also told her colleague to stop talking to Luska as if she knew him, showing even more of her overprotective personality. Lynn declared that the mansion's residents should be able to greet each other and noted that Luska had approached her first, not the other way around. Then she asked why Marianne suddenly switched to formal speech after speaking so casually. The redhead only replied that hearing the two of them talk informally was not good for the child's development. She also said that, in fact, she thought Lynn's very presence was bad for his upbringing, so she would appreciate it if she disappeared from her sight that instant. Lynn asked why she would be bad for his emotional well-being, noting that her presence was actually very beneficial for the emotional development of any child. At that moment, Chezik approached and asked if everyone was there to socialize. With a sexy posture, the man asked if they would mind if he joined the conversation, noting that it was a perfect atmosphere for sunbathing. Seeing the state of her friend, Lynn became very worried, since just like the first time she saw him, Chezik was soaked from head to toe. So she asked what had happened to him and why he was all wet again. But what Chezik said was nothing new, since he had ended up that way by rescuing the children's ball from inside the lake. Upon hearing this, the redhead declared with a scornful smile how ridiculous that scene was. Then she turned to Chezik and said that sometimes she wondered if he was foolish or just faking it, noting that it didn't matter to her either way. Those were the last words they exchanged before the woman took Luska's hand and left. The two friends remained silent until the colleague left the garden for good, probably thinking to themselves that the caretaker of room 1 was only friendly with Luska among everyone in the mansion. Then the blonde asked if he had just been insulted by Marianne, and Lynn replied that she thought so. Cheswick said that he usually understood things easily, but he didn't quite know what the redhead had meant by that. And since Lynn didn't want to continue on that subject, she brought up another topic to cover. She said that she should warn the boys not to play near the lake so often, as it could be dangerous. But Cheswick said that he already told them that every time he saw them there, and while the man scratched his head, our protagonist once again admired the handsome muscles of the four-eyed man. He went on to say that the boys never listened to him, and there was still the problem of him feeling bad about always interrupting their play. That's why things like that always ended up happening again. At that moment, Chezik grabbed the hem of his wet shirt and wrung the water out, exposing part of his sculpted abdomen. Lynn did not avoid looking and thought that the designers had worked hard to make him fit and handsome. To put it simply, this game focuses mainly on creating young angels, but it is also highly praised for its dating simulations, which in other words, means that if an NPC is attractive, it is probably possible to start a romance with him. And even though she hadn't looked very well, Lynn was sure that Chezik looked very good without glasses. Lost in thought, Lynn hadn't realized she was staring intensely at Chezik, and the man soon said he felt shy with that look. Lynn laughed and said that Chezik's abs were exactly her ideal type, so she couldn't help but look. Without delay, the blonde approached, saying that it was good to hear that she thought his body was attractive, and he asked her to feel free to look as much as she wanted. Then he asked, in a tone that mixed sincerity and playfulness, if he should take it all off. Lynn asked if he would really do that, and Chezik told her to wait a moment. But as soon as he began unbuttoning his shirt, Lynn hurriedly stopped him. When the rookie said she hadn't been serious, Chezik chuckled softly and said it was a shame. That was when she realized she had been tricked. Lynn really thought he would undress, but the blonde replied with a no way. He was too shy for that. But if Lynn really wanted, he said he could gather the courage and show her a little something when they were alone. If I were in the game, I'd be shameless and just accept the offer. She immediately refused the offer, although just a short while ago she seemed very eager to see more. It's true that it was tempting for her, but our protagonist still kept some reason. Then she noticed that Diane's class would soon be over, and as a caretaker, she needed to go fetch him. Moments later, Chezik and Lin began walking toward the garden entrance. On the way back, the rookie asked her colleague if he had been in the mansion for about a year. He confirmed that yes, showing satisfaction that she remembered their previous conversation. However, his answer to Lin's next question was more reserved. When she asked if he knew when Marianne of Room 1 had arrived at the mansion, Cheswick grew sad that she wasn't showing much interest in him. The man then rested his chin in one hand thoughtfully. Then he replied that Marianne had arrived after him about 3 seasons ago, so about 9 or 10 months. Lin thought that this was not as long as she had imagined. Of course, she still did not know if the ghosts in the annex were really the previous pair from Room 1, but if they were, it meant that the story of ghost sightings in the annex was much shorter than she had imagined. Then she stopped for a minute, realizing that if Cheswick had arrived before Marianne, then he must have known the previous caretaker of Room 1. When she asked him this question, Cheswick confirmed that yes, he had known her. Lin asked what she was like, but this time he did not answer immediately. Cheswick asked why she wanted to know, and Lin explained that she was just curious about the previous caretaker of Room 1 and that there was something about them she wanted to know. The man then stared at the young woman with a mysterious look and asked what exactly she wanted to find out. Because depending on her reasons, perhaps he could not give an answer. Lin watched him, perplexed, as her colleague spoke as if his past were connected to that story. She clarified that it was nothing important. She just wanted to know what the relationship was between the previous caretaker of Room 1 and Marianne. And that was something Cheswick could answer. Cheswick revealed that the previous caretaker of Room 1 was Marianne's sister, and that Luska, who currently lived in Room 1, was the twin of the child who lived there before. After the previous pair left this world, Marianne and Luska were chosen to come to the mansion. It was certainly an unusual case. The caretakers of Room 1 were blood sisters, and the children too. The intimate connection made Lin feel sad, for now she understood why Marianne had reacted so violently before. If the ghosts in the annex were really the previous pair, then Lin had spoken of Marianne's deceased sister right in front of her. Putting herself in the redhead's place, if someone had mentioned seeing a ghost that looked like her lost sister, the reaction would have been much worse. In that case, it was rather restrained of her to attack only once. Our protagonist felt a little uncomfortable. If that were the real world, she would have been shocked at her own lack of tact and would have immediately sought Marianne to apologize. But on the other hand, this was only a game, and feeling genuine guilt or pity for a character seemed like an overreaction. Lost in thought, Lin absent-mindedly asked if the two had been attacked by a Moros. Cheswick replied that no, explaining that the deceased one was not that weak. And she was also not the type to fail at protecting her child. Hearing this, Lin was even more surprised and asked how they had left this world. But Cheswick did not continue explaining. Instead, he smiled and said goodbye, saying that they would have to part ways there and that he would see her later. She watched, thoughtful, as Cheswick climbed the long staircase. And when he had already reached a certain distance, Lin called his name, making the man stop immediately. She said she wanted to ask just one last question, so he asked what it was she wanted to know this time. Lin then mentioned the one who had prepared the corpse flower for her welcome party, and asked who he thought had been responsible for that prank, if he had to choose one person in the mansion who would do such a thing. A different kind of smile appeared on Cheswick's lips, and he replied that, in his opinion, the new caretaker already knew the answer. After that, we are transported back to earlier that same day, when Marianne was leaving the garden thinking about Lin's words, and Luska called her name. The boy asked if she did not like the caretaker of Room 7. And Marianne could tell, despite the boy not expressing himself very well, that Luska was bothered by what had happened earlier. Marianne replied that it was not that, making her protégé's anxiety ease. She was also someone who did not easily show her thoughts, but what she said did not seem to be a lie. The details Lin had told her about the veiled woman in front of the purple room kept coming back to her mind. And the girl's precise look when speaking about the ghost's hair color touched an even deeper part of Marianne. She was still not sure if Lin was genuinely innocent or if she was pretending to be so to hide her intentions. However, she did not feel the darkness that usually exists in people full of malice. Of course, even so, she could not completely lower her guard. As someone responsible for protecting the children, she had to be cautious. Thus, Marianne commented that Luska seemed to have been in the sun for too long and that it was almost time for his medicine. Therefore, they should return to the boys' room. Luska agreed without any resistance and held the caretaker's hand, showing that the bond between the two was perhaps stronger than that of all the other pairs. Could this be because they had shared the same sorrow in the past? As she walked with her protégé, Marianne reflected that, although she had already heard about the annex building, she had considered all of it as just another rumor. But Lynn's words about having gone to the annex recently, and having seen the woman herself, kept echoing in her mind. If the novice was telling the truth, Marianne would have no choice but to visit the place. Could the ghosts in the annex in fact be people she had known? If that were the case, the caretaker of Room 1 had an important question she needed to ask the ghost. And as her gaze drifted off into the distance, Marianne thought of how close her reunion might be with Marinese, the sister who had been mercilessly stolen from her. And that's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the story. What do you think? This story has a lot of mystery. I'm really curious about so many things. At first, I thought Cheswick was also a player, but now I don't think so. He's just a very mysterious hottie like everything else in this mansion. Tell me your theories in the comments. The name of this work is How to Protect the Young Master of Monster Manor, and our recap went up to chapter 20. And if you want more, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any new uploads I post. Kisses and see you next time.